You are listening to The Goodbye Girl, Pemberton Manor, Book 1, written and narrated by Becky Doughty. Chapter 1. Wait up, please. The man standing at the back of the old-fashioned lift just stared at me as I careened through the small lobby, 2 bulging canvas grocery bags slung over my shoulder and dragging my overloaded luggage trolley behind me. "Thanks for your help," I muttered under my breath, as I turned and wedged myself through the narrow opening. I wasn't worried about him picking up on my sarcasm. Earbud cords hung down either side of his neck and disappeared inside the collar of his coat. But I was so relieved there was someone else riding up with me that I didn't care. It was Christmas Eve, for St. Nick's sake, and I wasn't going to let some rude guy in an elevator get to me. Okay, it wasn't an elevator, not by a long shot. As far as I was concerned, it barely qualified as a lift. An ancient Otis manual traction elevator, it was operated by a hand crank set into one wall of the cab. Move the lever clockwise to go up, counterclockwise to go down, bring it to 12 o'clock to stop. And it was not self-leveling. It took a bit of finesse to line the bottom of the lift up with whatever floor you were stopping at. The first time I'd braved it, and only after Sarah's relentless badgering, it had gotten stuck just past the 2nd floor. My sister had laughed at my mini panic and casually slid open the accordion cage door and then slammed it shut again, latching it back into place. "Sometimes it does that," she explained, as I stared in horror at the gaping opening between the threshold of the lift and the brick wall of the shaft. "What if I got my leg stuck in there right as the thing started up again?" I asked, horrified at the grisly images that flooded my overactive imagination. "How can this thing even be legal?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "You sound like one of my kids, always suggesting the most improbable scenarios." She eyed me over her shoulder as she slid the door latch in place before reaching for the crank again. "Not only would your leg not even fit in there, Gracie, but why on earth would you put it in there in the first place?" She had a point, but thankfully I didn't have to acknowledge her superior reasoning skills because the elevator had responded with a clank and a shudder, and then lurched its way up the shaft until Sarah brought it to a stop in perfect position at the 3rd floor level. The screeching of the sliding door grated against my nerves, and for just a moment I experienced a visceral sympathy for domesticated birds living in their pretty little cages. I clamped my teeth together and didn't say another word as I waited for her to push open the security door to let us out. The security door that supposedly kept folks from tumbling to their deaths into the shaft when the elevator was on a different floor. "Why do you even take this thing if it gets stuck all the time?" I ventured to ask her. "It doesn't get stuck all the time, only every once in a while, and then you just have to reset it. No big deal." Maybe no big deal to her, but her brain didn't work the way mine did. Besides, there's just something about this old Otis. It's one of the reasons I chose to rent an apartment here. I think it gives Pemberton Manor character, don't you? Character or not, here I was, launching myself back into the leg-crushing death trap, this time with someone who clearly couldn't care less about the fact that I might be a bit of a nervy co-passenger. In fact, he looked right past me, as though I wasn't even worth the effort to acknowledge. Must be some good music he was listening to. The cheesy old Aerosmith song about love and elevators popped into my head against my will, making me feel even more uncomfortable. But I consoled myself with the certainty that there would be no love lost in this elevator. I smiled politely at the guy anyway. He didn't smile back, and then realized I'd effectively boxed him in, and now I would have to be responsible for operating the lift. I spun around, a brief, futile hope rising up in me that the brass-plated crank mechanism had been upgraded to a backlit numbered panel. "Oh," I said as I took in the tiny woman in the corner and the even tinier little girl at her side. Her tiny little girl hands gripped the crank, and her tiny little girl face was lit up with anticipation. The only thing that wasn't tiny about the duo was the woman's belly bulging out from the front of her unbuttoned coat. She looked like she was due to give birth at any moment. The woman's hand on the girl's shoulder wasn't resting there lightly, I noticed. If not for the child's puffy jacket, she might have left bruises with her white-knuckled grip. I forced my mouth to soften into a gentler smile than the one I'd given the guy, but the woman spared me only a quick glance before shifting her gaze back to the floor at her feet. Was she all right? In pain? Oh, geez, was she in labor? Please let us not get stuck tonight. The thought raced through my head. "Is this it?" I asked, my words bursting out of my mouth in feigned excitement the way Sarah's did when she was trying to get the attention of all 21 of her first-grade students. I cleared my throat and tried again in a calmer, more non-teacher tone. "Are we waiting for anyone else?" "Nope," the child declared in her tiny little girl voice, bouncing up and down on her tiny little girl toes. Or at least I assumed they were, since they were hidden inside tiny little girl ladybug rain boots. "Let's go, let's go, let's go!" I swallowed hard and looked away. Every time she bounced, her head bumped against her mother's belly. "Please don't pop, please don't pop, please don't pop." I looked over my shoulder at the man who was now studying a section of the decorative molding that ran along the top of the paneled walls of the cab. Apparently, he hadn't heard my question. "Sir?" I said, a little louder, resisting the urge to jerk one of the speakers from his ears. "Are you waiting for anyone else?" Why I'd taken it upon myself to make sure no one else was joining us, I had no idea. Maybe I was subconsciously hoping I'd have to get off the lift to make room. The man turned and met my eyes, albeit only briefly, but then in a quiet voice replied, "I am not," before looking beyond me again. What was with these people and the whole no eye contact thing? Well, and once again I was channeling Sarah. Her chipper voice inside my head bolstered me, however, and I needed all the courage I could amass at the moment. I'm not quite sure how to do this, but there's a first time for everything, right? I reached for the handle of the cage door and began to tug on it. It didn't budge. "You had to lock the other door and push the button on the floor first," said the child, who couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. "Want me to show you?" I glanced at the girl's mother for cues, but the woman just withdrew her hand from her daughter's shoulder and rested back against the wood paneling behind her. "Careful, Itzy," she said. Her voice was husky, not like a smoker's, but like that of someone who didn't speak a lot. There were dark circles under her eyes, and the slump of her shoulders led me to believe she was taking the elevator because she might just be too weary to take the stairs today. Although the child appeared well cared for with her rosy cheeks and shiny blonde hair, the bones in the woman's face seemed too close to the surface, and her hands, now folded over her distended belly, showed no signs of late pregnancy weight gain or water retention. She looked too skinny to be healthy. Was it just a difficult pregnancy? Or worse? A creepy sci-fi movie I'd watched with my brothers years ago flashed through my mind. In it, aliens came to Earth to live in peace among humans, but to their dismay, their babies kept dying before they were born. Through a series of ridiculously contrived circumstances, the aliens discovered that if their babies had humans as surrogate mothers, they acclimated to life on Earth. The movie got weird then because the combination of healthy human prenatal care and advanced alien development created these alien super babies that got a little too aggressive in utero. They essentially turned into little parasites that ate their way out of their surrogates. I coughed and swallowed hard, willing away the mental images, but when I saw the woman's belly twitch and roll under her laced fingers, I looked away quickly and focused instead on Itzy. She clearly was no alien super baby, but a sweet, normal, human child. Itzy. For some reason, the name delighted me. Was it a fried green tomatoes reference? An itsy-bitsy spider tribute? Short for something like Isabella or Elizabeth? Wherever it derived from, it fit the diminutive child perfectly, and I grinned down at her. "Sure, why don't you show me how the door works?" I bit back the warning to make sure she didn't get her leg stuck in the gap. Itzy instructed me on how to make certain the safety door was latched first, and then squatted and pointed at the foot release on the floor at the edge of the threshold.
"Step on that button first, then you can close the pretty door."
The pretty door. Not a label I'd use to describe the bars that would lock us in. I wondered if the mother and child had ever gotten stuck inside the old Otis. "Got it," I said, and waited until Itzy had popped back up and stepped away before I slid my foot forward. I hesitated briefly, giving only a moment's airtime to the vision of me pushing the lever the wrong way and sending us all plummeting to our deaths. Then I squared my shoulders, pressed down on the foot release mechanism, and slid the metal cage shut.
"Can I turn the handle now?"
Itzy asked, bouncing in place again. At her mother's nod, she applied herself to the task with great concentration, the tiny tip of her tongue protruding from between pursed lips. She took us down first. I hadn't even been aware there was a basement in the old place. My oldest sister lived on the third floor of a stately 100-year-old home that had been converted into apartment living sometime in the last 20 or 30 years. Pemberton Manor was one of many old Victorians in our area that had met such a fate. Midtown residents took great pride in their city with its prestigious Southern California University, the registered historical district, and the quaint downtown Main Street. There was an open-air amphitheater that housed class act performances every summer, and the streets that meandered through delightfully varied neighborhoods marked the routes for annual bicycle races, marathons, holiday parades, and more. But over the last several years, Midtown had seen a surge of growth and development, which meant the old blue bloods had to make way for the up-and-comers with their hybrid transportation and dual-income no-kids lifestyles. Now, instead of these old, converted Victorians housing college students who opted to live off campus, more often than not, the studio apartments were being filled with renters like Sarah, who had steady jobs and no plans to move anytime soon. I supposed the owners of places like Pemberton Manor were fine with that. They didn't have to worry about finding new renters every semester or having to clean up after university students who saved up their laundry for summer vacation. But every time I stepped foot inside Pemberton Manor, I couldn't help feeling just a little bit sorry for the old dame. At one time, I imagined she'd been a tall and elegant beauty with her gabled windows and sharply angled roof lines, the spindled balconies and wide covered porch. But now, the house just felt weary to me, tired, not quite taking care of the way she once was. Too many people coming and going, taking bits and pieces of her soul with them, and leaving less and less of her behind. It didn't help that the maintenance guy, Sean something or other, didn't maintain much of anything around the place. Sean lived on the property in a detached converted garage, and Sarah insisted he had to be a distant relative of the homeowner. There was no other explanation for him being able to keep the job he never performed. She only called him when she was in dire straits and couldn't figure out how to repair something by Googling it. Those calls typically ended with her contacting a professional, at Sean's advice, of course, which is the only reason she even called him in the first place. If he recommended a professional, then it was paid for by the landlord. The Otis elevator jolted to a stop, and Itzy cried out,
B is for basement.
Itzy's mother clapped softly, so I joined in. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence while Itzy beamed at the oblivious man in the corner, I added encouragingly, still using my Sarah voice, "That's right. And what floor are you and your mommy going to tonight?"
3.
she proclaimed, and I clapped with much greater enthusiasm. Chapter 2. Wow, 3rd floor, really? Me too. I can't wait. I was already late. I'd promised Sarah I'd be there by 6 so we could get everything prepped in time to sit down and watch the 7 o'clock showing of White Christmas, a time-honored tradition in our household. Surrounded by bowls of popcorn, platters of Christmas cookies, and mugs of hot chocolate and eggnog, Sarah and I planned to video chat with the rest of the family who were gathered at the big house for the same movie, the coffee tables and sideboards over there overflowing with holiday goodies as well. We'd all sing along with the classic Christmas songs, ooh and ah over the crazy dance moves and Vera Ellen's terrifying thigh gap, without the help of Photoshop no less, and then we'd go around the room taking turns opening our one token Christmas Eve present. My poor sister had chicken pox, something she'd somehow managed to avoid as a child. I, on the other hand, had suffered such a terrible case of the childhood illness that I'd been hospitalized with a secondary infection. Since I was basically immune, I offered to keep Sarah company during the Christmas festivities. I was also overnighting there. Then in the morning we'd call home again so we could spend Christmas morning together via video chat too. It wasn't quite the same as all of us being under one roof, but honestly, with 2 of our 4 brothers married and starting families of their own, the 5-bedroom house was getting a little crowded. After the last 2 days of having everyone underfoot, I was kind of looking forward to having Sarah's tiny 2nd bedroom all to myself for the night. I propped my cart against the cage door a minute, turned my shoulder away from the man in the elevator with us, and dug my phone out of my bra where I'd shoved it earlier to free up my hands. 6:08 p.m. I was surprised Sarah hadn't called to check on me. I sent her off a quick text. In the elevator, armed and dangerous, got stuck with Aunt Doty's killer fruitcake. The Otis is being operated by a miniature person, and I have no idea what the flight plan is, but destination has been confirmed as 3rd floor sometime this evening. I shoved the phone back in my bra, not bothering to wait for her reply. I knew what it would be. She'd most assuredly take a stab at my habitual tardiness. It might be as harmless as an eye-rolling emoji or a meme of the white rabbit with his googly eyes and stopwatch, or she might go all out and reply with a gif of some random scene from one of the Bridget Jones movies. At which point, I'd remind her that my gal pal Bridget always ended up with at least 2 men fighting for her affections, and she always chose the right one. Honestly, I didn't feel up to that bicker banter at the moment. In fact, I was on the verge of swearing off men altogether, at least for a while. It had been over a year since I'd been in a serious relationship, and although I thought I made for a pretty good date, and had been on several since the breakup, the last time I'd actually had fun out on the town with a guy was back in March, and that hadn't even been on purpose. I'd gone to a movie by myself, something I kinda enjoyed doing. A blindingly handsome man, and I say that because from the moment he sat next to me, everything else in the theater faded into the background, scooted down the row to make room for a large group, and he ended up sharing an armrest with me. The movie had been a disappointment, quite likely because I hadn't really watched much of it after the first elbow bump, but the guy beside me was not. We cut out of there about 15 minutes before it was over, having agreed that neither of us cared whether the whole cast and crew lived or died. Once outside the theater, the guy took both my hands and said, "I want to be up front with you, okay? I have to catch a plane in 5 hours. I'm going home to Denver and don't plan to come back to California anytime soon. I'd love your company until then, but will understand perfectly if you'd rather call it a night." And totally out of character for me, I shook his hand and introduced myself as Ruby Malone, a name that came to me on the spot like divine inspiration. In fact, I've now dubbed my alter ego Ruby Malone. She's the snarky, feisty me who does all the things I want to do but shouldn't, because my mother raised me right. So, that night, as Ruby Malone, I didn't entertain a single thought of serial killers or blind date horror stories until long after I'd kissed Calvin goodbye. I think he actually gave me his real name and sent him on his way back to his mile-high city. It took me a while to recover from that. I alternated between gut-wrenching nausea over what horrific scene could have played out if my mother's stranger danger warnings were to be believed, and hopelessness over knowing I'd never see Calvin, or meet anyone else like him, again. I was absolutely certain I'd never again experience the thrill of being utterly and completely spontaneous the way I had that evening. Self-fulfilling prophecy or not, there was no Calvin-esque man in my life, and I was beginning to fear it would never happen. So lately, Sarah's gentle jabs at my less-than-ideal character traits, although certainly not malicious, hit a little too close to home, and the fact that I was going to spend Christmas Eve partying with my sick sister, whose steady boyfriend, might I point out, wasn't coming within 50 feet of his sick girlfriend lest he catch chickenpox and become sterile, but who had yet to even produce a ring after 3 years of serious dating, and the fact that I was utterly and irrefutably single was something I had no desire to admit to anyone but my closest family.
"Number 1 is for first floor,"
cried Itzy, rotating the crank too quickly back to center. We lurched to a stop about 3 feet above the actual floor level, which put the large red number on the safety door right at Itzy's eye level. I stood in the middle of the elevator, so the sudden stop had me flailing a little, the strap of one of my heavy bags slipping from my shoulder and down my arm. It thumped heavily against my knee, and I stepped back, my heel coming down none too delicately on the toes of the man who stood behind me. He grunted, a raw male sound that expressed both surprise and pain, I had no doubt. "I am so sorry," I said, wondering again if perhaps the stairs might have been a better option after all. But no, I'd insisted on making it all in one trip, and there was no way I could have lugged everything up 2 flights of stairs in one go. Did I hurt you? Stupid question. Of course I'd hurt him. "It's okay," he said, shaking his head ever so slightly. But he sidestepped a little, so he was no longer directly behind me. "No worries." No worries? Was there really such a thing as no worries? Especially when one was riding up 3 stories in a mine shaft that could collapse at any moment? I'd read about that group of Chilean mine workers, the Los 33, who'd been buried alive in a dark mine shaft for a record 69 days. My stomach lurched at the thought of 2 months of inky blackness. I righted myself just in time for a surprise takeoff, courtesy of Itzy at the helm, and stumbled sideways. The guy clumsily cupped a hand around my elbow to steady me, but said nothing, even when I smiled my gratitude at him over my shoulder. "Gentle Itzy, remember to turn the crank slowly. the girl's mother instructed in her aged whiskey voice.
Sorry,
Itzy murmured, her shoulders hunching up around her ears. She darted a sideways look up at me. You're very good at this, I assured her as we approached the second floor. Is this your job? Are you an elevator operator?
No, silly lady.
She brought her hands up to cover her mouth as she snickered behind them.
I'm only a little girl. I don't have a job yet.
The lever drifted to the center upright position, and the elevator slowed to a gentle stop. Only the bottom half of the second-floor safety door was visible. Oh, I exclaimed, feigning shock. Now that you mention it, I can see that you are the shortest one in the room.
No, I'm not,
Itzy shot back, and then jabbed a pointy little finger at her mother's belly. The woman flinched, and I couldn't help it. I did too.
There's a baby in there, and I'm bigger than him. He's my little brother.
I nodded sagely. I see. Then I eyed the visible half of the second-floor door and reached for my phone again. 6:20 p.m. We'd been at it for more than 10 minutes already. Honey, let's get going. Itzy's mother nudged the crank clockwise, just enough to get the lift moving upward again.
I can do it,
Itzy said, a determined scowl marring her features. She pushed her mother's hand away and grabbed the crank again.
Number 2 is for second floor.
This time, the stop was a little smoother, but I'd sidled around my cart to grab the handrail just in case. The guy behind me braced my shoulder with a steadying hand anyway, just for a moment. I had to bite back a wayward giggle. I doubted he was worried about my safety. I wore my favorite wedge boots, and between the stacked heel and my 186 pounds backing it up, I was pretty sure the toes of his left foot were curled up in terror inside his brown suede chukkas. Any other time, I would have complimented him on his shoes. I actually had a pair of Steve Madden chukkas that I loved. Mine were soft black leather that looked amazing with my leggings and peasant tops, and they were incredibly comfortable. I didn't even care that they were made for men. I was tall enough to wear them without looking like I had on my big brother's shoes, even though they actually did belong to Luke. I'd borrowed them for some event ages ago and just kept conveniently forgetting to give them back. I was pretty sure that as long as he never saw me wearing them, Luke would eventually forget he'd owned a pair. "Let's go, baby," Itzy's mother prompted again. I glanced over at her, the tone of her voice catching my attention. She still leaned against the wall, but her arms were crossed now, and her hands were clenched tightly against her ribs. Her skin seemed even paler than it had a few moments ago. "Are you okay?" I asked, a bubble of concern inflating inside my chest. The woman had her eyes fixed on the crank, almost as if willing the mechanism to work faster. But she blinked slowly and then turned to smile at me. "I'm just a little claustrophobic, so I can only handle being in here for so long. Itzy, on the other hand, would ride up and down in this cage all day if I let her." She released her breath in a rush as the bottom of the third-floor safety door came into view through the crisscrossing bars of the cage door. Oh, the things mothers did for their children. "Who needs Disneyland when you can ride an Otis, right?" I asked, in a vain attempt to make light of the situation. The man behind me chuckled. He actually had a reaction to my comment. I cocked my head and grinned at him over my shoulder, expecting to find an answering smile on his face. Nope, stoic as ever, and not even acknowledging me with a glance. Must have been something he was listening to through his earbuds that made him laugh. Itzy bent over to scratch her ankle, the hand on the crank suddenly changing directions so the elevator made a loud clunking sound, jerked a few times, and then started back down. "No, Itzy!" The panic in Itzy's mom's voice was very close to the surface. "Turn it the other way. We need to go up." I grabbed for the handrail again, and a long-fingered hand wrapped around my arm just above my elbow, once again keeping me from stumbling.
"Sorry!"
Itzy cried out. She straightened and spun the crank clockwise again, causing a repeat of the clunking and jerking, followed by a few stuttering lurches upward, and then we stopped. The pregnant woman reached over her daughter's head and pushed the little girl's hands away. "Let me do it, baby." Itzy stepped back, her big eyes filling with tears. Her mother rotated the crank to the center position, which would have brought the elevator to a stop if we'd been moving up or down. She shimmied it back and forth a few times, her head tilted as if listening for something. I heard it then, a faint clicking, similar to the sound a combination lock makes when you move the dial past the 0 mark. The woman rotated the lever very slowly in a clockwise direction. Nothing happened. Back to center until she heard the click again. She moved it to the left, counterclockwise, slowly, listening, her shoulders hunched just like her daughter's. "Oh, baby, it's stuck again." She turned to the little girl and cupped Itzy's cheek. "What did I tell you? What did I say about the old crank?"
"It's a crabby crank and I have to go slow or it will get mad and quit."
Itzy's voice wavered, her words barely audible.
"I'm sorry, Mommy. My leg was itchy. I had to itch it. I just had to."
"Are you sure it's stuck?" I asked in as pleasant a voice as I could muster. Maybe she was just using the circumstances as an object lesson for Itzy. "Do you want me to try it? What are you listening for?" Itzy's mother drew in a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and seemed to gather her composure. Her glance past my shoulder indicated she was including the guy behind me in whatever she had to say. "I'm so sorry. I'm sure of it. I mean, you can try it if you want, but we've done this before." She sighed, a heavy sound that indicated she might be carrying a much larger burden than just being pregnant and stuck in an elevator with an excitable child. And an adult with an overactive imagination. That would be me. And a strange guy. Except that he could have been a wallflower for all he was participating in the moment. Still, his mere presence added a disquieting element to the situation. What was his deal anyway? "There's this sound it makes, like a ratcheting sound," she continued. "You know, when the notches line up and make the gears rotate together?" She laced her fingers in front of her, rotating her hands to demonstrate. She paused, as though waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. "Mm-hmm," I nodded encouragingly, my eyes wide. "Well, I don't hear that sound. And the last time this happened to us, it was because we switched directions without coming to a full stop." She put a protective arm around Itzy and drew her close to her side. "Like we did just now," she added, her voice fading to a near whisper. I didn't miss the collective we she used. Good mommy, taking responsibility for her child's actions. "So does this happen often to you?" I asked, wondering why on earth people kept using the thing if it didn't work right. Sarah had waived my concerns, saying it didn't happen often, but I was 2 for 2 now. "Not really. We take it every day, multiple times a day, and it's only happened 2 other times to us. We figure the odds aren't bad since Itzy likes it so much."
"And the stairs make my legs wobbly,"
Itzy added, her eyes round.
"There are lots and lots of them."
As far as I was concerned, my 2 for 2 was not good odds, especially since I'd taken the stairs countless times without ever getting stuck. Itzy was right about the effect the stairs had on one's legs, but at least you always got where you needed to go. Besides, I had a home-cooked Christmas meal and a movie to get to. The somber man behind me surely had some place to be. And if I was reading the signs right, Itzy's mother was more than just a little claustrophobic. A fine film of sweat made her two prominent cheekbones glisten under the glow of the dated light fixture overhead. Her hands were visibly shaking again, and she kept glancing over at the 6 inches of the 3rd floor that was just visible through the top of the metal cage door. "What about that alarm?" I asked, pointing at the set of black switches in the brass panel below the crank. Above one, it read, "Emergency stop." Above the middle switch, "Alarm," and above the 3rd switch were the words, "Lights on/off." Itzy reached for the 3rd switch. My breath caught in my throat, but her mother pushed her hand away and leaned forward so she could look her daughter in the eyes. "No, Itzy, don't touch anything else right now." Then she turned back to me. "We can try that. It's just really, really loud, and if Sean, the maintenance guy or manager or whatever he is, isn't in the building or in his apartment, he might not hear it." She lifted one shoulder resignedly. "Speaking from experience. We used it the last time, but after the first 10 minutes, I finally turned off the alarm and just called the maintenance number over and over until he finally picked up." "Well, let's start with that," I suggested. I had no desire whatsoever to sit in this death trap and listen to an old-fashioned alarm jangling around our heads. I glanced around the tiny elevator cab, looking for some kind of notice of what to do and who to call in case of emergency. When I'd been in the lift with Sarah, there'd been a plastic page protector fastened to the wall with emergency information in case of fire, assault, and a myriad of other things. I remembered because I'd noticed someone with great forethought had added, "In case of a zombie uprising, dial 1-800-DAY-DEAD," to the bottom of the list. But today, said list was nowhere to be found. That had to be some code violation for sure. Chapter 3. "Do you by any chance have Sean's number?" I asked the woman, trying not to panic myself. I waved at the empty wall behind her. "The list of emergency numbers is gone." The woman nodded slowly and bit her bottom lip until I thought she might draw blood. She was on the verge of a meltdown, I was pretty sure. I wondered if she was afraid to call him, having been in this predicament before. Had he been a jerk to her? "You think he'll be angry?" Surely the guy wouldn't freak out over an obvious mistake. Itzy hadn't intentionally flipped the crank and jacked up the lift. "It's not that." Itzy's mother closed her eyes and swiped her fingers across her cheeks. I couldn't be sure if she was wiping away sweat or if maybe she was beginning to cry. I only have a few minutes left on my phone. It's prepaid." Her cheeks pinked up slightly. She wouldn't look me in the eyes. She shifted Itzy to stand in front of her and smoothed the pale hair from the girl's forehead, a tender gesture that tugged at my heart. She cleared her throat and continued. "I was saving them until tomorrow so Itzy could call her grandparents."
That's my Christmas present for them. Grumpy says my voice is prettier than the angel on top of his Christmas tree."
Itzy glowed with pleasure at the compliment. "Oh, of course," I said. Had the child really just called her grandfather Grumpy? Pretty cute, to be sure, but I wondered what he thought of that. I had no clue what this little mother-daughter duo's story was, but obviously things were difficult for them. Anxious to set the woman's mind at ease, I offered, "Do you want to use my phone, or do you want me to call him?" I dug inside the neck of my sweater and withdrew my phone. The woman's eyebrows went up, and she grinned when I held it out to her. "Oh, sorry." I rubbed the phone against my skirt a few times, like that would remove any residual boob germs or something. I punched in my password and offered it to her again. Then I remembered the guy behind me. I could feel my cheeks grow warm, and I braved a glance in his direction. Had he seen me rooting around in my bra? Apparently, completely unaffected by what was going on, he stood there leaning against the back wall of the elevator, his hands in the pockets of his hip-length car coat, his eyes closed. What was he listening to? Was it so important that he couldn't put it aside to maybe contribute some assistance? A pocket knife? A stick of gum? Anything to the situation? No MacGyver, this one. "You're awfully quiet," I said, doing my best to keep my voice pleasant. "Is being stuck in here no big deal to you?" The man straightened and opened his eyes, but he didn't meet mine. Instead, he zoned in on my mouth. I frowned at his boldness. "I didn't want to interrupt," he said in a slow, cultured manner. "You two seem to be sorting things out without me adding to the melee out of some misguided sense of male obligation." He lifted one shoulder but didn't look away. "I agree that we should start by calling this Sean fellow." "Okay," I said, a little taken aback by his unexpectedly effusive response, and bothered by the way he kept staring at my lips. I turned away from him, disliking the way my skin prickled at the thought of him studying me from behind. Thank goodness I was wearing my vintage circle coat that fell well below my backside. He'd have to have X-ray vision to see anything through the thick red fleece. "Sean, this is Lucy from apartment 3C, Itzy's mother said into my phone. I'm calling from inside the elevator. We're stuck between the second and third floor. Sorry to bother you, but we need you to come get us out." She shot me an apologetic grimace and mouthed, "What's your number?" She repeated the number I gave her into the phone. "We're stuck, Sean," she reiterated. "Please call back as soon as you get this message." Lucy handed me my phone with another look of regret. "I hope he's around. I'm a little afraid he might have had somewhere to go tonight." "It is Christmas Eve," I acknowledged, and peered down at the blank screen of my phone. Sarah hadn't ever replied to my text. I punched in her number, but the phone rang 4 times and then went to voicemail. "Sarah, where are you?" "Hey, listen. The elevator stopped between the second and third floors, and now we're stuck here. Do you think you can call your maintenance guy for us? We tried calling him, but we're just getting his voicemail. We'll keep calling from here, but if you'd try from another line, that might help too." I paused a moment. Where the heck was she, and why wasn't she answering her phone? "Regardless, please call me as soon as you get this message." I felt like Lucy's echo. "Just to let me know you're okay." I swiped my phone closed and pasted on a smile as I turned back to face mother and daughter. "By the way, I'm Grace. I'm going up to visit my sister in 3A. She picked up a nasty case of chickenpox right after school let out. She's an elementary school teacher and is too miserable to join the family Christmas fun. So I'm bringing Christmas to her."
"I had chicken spots," chirped Itzy. "They're disgustamungus."
"Itzy?" Lucy put a hand on her daughter's head. I laughed. Actually, they are. They're disgustamungus and itchy and gross and uncomfortable, and they make you crabby and mean and sick.
"I barfed up chicken spots."
"Itzy!" Her mother spoke louder, her husky voice cracking a little.
"What, Mommy?"
"No, you didn't."
"I did," the child insisted. "I saw them in the barf bucket. Or maybe it was chicken blood and guts."
A girl after my own heart. "I'm Lucy, and this is Itzy," the woman said, drawing her outspoken daughter to her side, pointedly not acknowledging the last comment. She didn't hold out her other hand for me to shake, but kept it spread protectively over the ripe curve of her belly. "And if the ultrasound was right, this is Oliver."
"I call him Ollie."
Itzy poked at her mother's stomach gently, and then pressed her mouth to the bulge.
"Hi, Ollie in there. It's me, Itsy. You coming out soon?"
Lucy rolled her eyes. "Lord, I hope not. We're not ready for him yet, honey." "When are you due?" I asked. I set the heavy bags I was carrying on the floor at my feet, but kept a hold of the handles so they wouldn't topple and spill their contents. Who knew how long we'd be stuck in the tiny cubicle? "February 10th, she said, and swallowed hard, making me think perhaps she wasn't exactly joyously anticipating the pending birth. I waited a moment for her to say what, I wasn't sure, and then nodded, letting the topic rest. But I noticed a fluttering pulse at the base of her throat, and it was definitely perspiration on her cheekbones and forehead, not tears. At least, not yet. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked again. She seemed paler than when we'd first gotten in the elevator. "Yes, I just hope Sean calls back soon. I'm not good in tight places." Lucy took in a deep breath and let it out slowly, closing her eyes again. "Hang in there. I'm sure he'll call back soon. My sister will bug him too." She nodded, but didn't open her eyes. I had to look away. Her simmering panic was beginning to draw out my own. I wasn't claustrophobic, though. In fact, I usually liked cozy places. I was that kid who built a secret fort under the stairs or in the crawl space or the linen closet. I loved sleeping under my bed because I could actually feel the limitations of the space around me in the dark. It was the dark I had a problem with. The unknown in the inky night. The possibility of taking a step out into an abyss. The thought of cave exploration or deep-sea diving or those dark dining restaurants where you eat in the pitch black, it all made me want to barf up chicken blood and guts. As long as the overhead light stayed on in this little elevator, I'd be okay. At least that's what I told myself. But I could feel my panic feeding off of hers, my heart rate speeding up a little. I had to get a grip, change the subject, think about something else. I nodded and shifted toward the man. "I'm Grace," I said to him, but I didn't let go of my bags to shake his hand, hoping he wouldn't think me rude. He didn't seem to mind. August Jones. Nice to meet you, ladies." His tone was so formal, for a moment I wondered if he was being sarcastic. But he nodded in Lucy and Itzy's direction, and then at me, and he seemed completely sincere.
"Ollie isn't a lady, mister. He's a baby," clarified Itzy.
August's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a grin, and nodded again. "My apologies. Nice to meet you ladies and baby." "Do you live in the building?" I asked, curious about the slightly aloof man who shared the tiny space with us. "No, I do not." When he offered nothing else, I cocked my head and narrowed my eyes at him, tired of his standoffish attitude. He didn't have to tell us his life story, or even his real name for that matter. I had no doubt August Jones was his nom de guerre, his version of my Ruby Malone, but didn't he have anything at all to say about the situation we were in? Besides, I wasn't easy to intimidate. I was what my 6'5" father called statuesque, standing at just above 5'11" in my socks. With or without the extra 3 inches my boots gave me, I would never be classified as a dainty creature. I squared my shoulders the way I did whenever I challenged one of my brothers, who were, like me, all on the tall and beefy side. "If you don't live in this building, then why are you in this elevator?" Okay, that came out a little more intense than I'd intended. I don't mean to pry, but come on, man. I mean, this whole setting. I waved my hand around to encompass all 4 of us, 5 if you counted Ollie. Kinda puts us all in each other's personal spaces here, you know what I mean? Do I need to keep an eye on you? I didn't want Itsy to worry, nor did I want Lucy's panic to bubble over, so I didn't raise my voice. But I let my growing impatience seep into the slightly sarcastic challenge. And he was staring at my mouth again. "I'm here to visit a man in 2A, he said, when I finally stopped talking. "But—" I frowned at him and waved at the elevator door. Sheesh, my hand seemed to have a mind of its own, waving around like a wind-up toy. I grabbed the handle of my luggage cart to give my hand something to do. "We just passed up the second floor. Why didn't you get off when you had the chance?" He cleared his throat, hesitated for the briefest of moments as though trying to come up with a good excuse. I narrowed my eyes at him. The guy might actually be a creep for reals. I glanced over at Lucy and then back at him. Stalker, maybe? Pedophile hoping to grab and run? I sized him up. I could probably hurt him if push came to shove.
"He wanted to go on a ride in the elevator with us,"
Itsy declared, glancing with owl eyes between August and me. Kids didn't miss much, did they?
"Right, mister?"
"Itsy, shh." Lucy patted her daughter's cheek, apparently sensing the direction of my thoughts. I glared at him, waiting for him to expound. Thank God I'd gotten on the elevator when I did. I refused to even consider what might have happened to the two little ladies, and Ollie, if I'd opted for the stairs this evening. Mr. Jones apparently sensed my disquiet too. He cleared his throat again and offered up an explanation. "I'm not in any hurry, so I thought I'd wait until the elevator ride was over before I got off." Uh-huh. August's eyebrows rose. How on earth had he heard that? Had I actually made the sound out loud? I darted a look at Lucy, but she seemed a bit preoccupied with keeping her breathing steady. "Was there something else you wanted to know?" he asked, a rather pompous quality to his question. "Oh, no, nobody nope. There would be no cowing to his superiority complex from me. Yeah, sure. You're a guy. Got any mechanical savvy? Do you have any idea how we might be able to get this thing moving again?" "I'm sorry, I'm not in the least bit gifted in that area." He shook his head slightly and one of his earbuds dropped to his shoulder. He pulled the whole headset free, methodically looped the cords together, and then stuffed them inside his coat. He didn't bother to turn off whatever he'd been listening to. I'd only make things worse if I made any attempts to fix it. "What about your friend in 2A?" I asked, trying another direction. "Shouldn't you call him and let him know you're stuck in here with us?" I was really starting to badger him. Back off, Ms. Malone. I mean, maybe he can try getting a hold of Sean, too. "I don't have his number," he said, still watching my mouth. Ms. Malone wanted to flick him in the forehead right between the eyes. "Okay." I tried to bite back the snip in my voice. I'd had just about as much of the guy's reticence as I could handle. "If it will set your mind at ease," August said before I could launch into the next phase of my interrogation. "The man is my father. I'm here for a surprise visit. He doesn't know I'm coming."
"Oh, I love surprises,"
Itsy exclaimed, taking a few steps toward us.
"Are you going to have a party?"
Then she eyed August suspiciously, leaning away from her mother's side in an attempt to peer around him.
"Didn't you bring a cake or balloons or anything?"
"Not this time," August said, turning to the little girl. My lips tingled with relief, freed for a moment from his intense scrutiny. "My dad doesn't really care for surprise parties, and I want him to be happy to see me."
"Are you the surprise then?"
Itsy asked, her eyes wide. She tugged on Lucy's coat sleeve without taking her eyes off August's face.
"I'm your favorite surprise, right, Mommy?"
"You are, baby," Lucy concurred, her voice more breathy than husky now. I eyed the little mama closely, not liking the way her eyes kept darting around the room.
Maybe next time you can bring him a balloon then, Itsy suggested. It doesn't have to be a surprise balloon. I like balloons even when they're not surprises.
Maybe next time I will do that. Then August smiled down at Itsy, an expression that changed his features so dramatically my chin dropped in surprise. Wow. Talk about a megawatt smile. I was suddenly glad he hadn't flashed one of those puppies at me when I'd first gotten on the elevator. I might have pulled the damsel in distress card after all. Although, admittedly, that was a tough act for me to pull off, high-heeled boots or not. The whole swooning thing wouldn't go over well if he decided I wasn't worth the potential back injury. I felt a flush creep up my neck at the thought of falling into him. Not because it was romantic. Nope. The scene that played out in my mind was humiliating. It involved oomph sounds and bruised ribs, and maybe a twisted ankle in the mix. But still, that smile. And he was here to surprise his dad. How precious was that? Maybe he wasn't such a creep after all. Except for that whole staring at my mouth when I was talking thing. I reached up to touch my lips just as he looked back at me, his smile still on high beam. The flush continued up my neck, suffusing my cheeks with heat as well. Chapter 4. I clapped my hands briskly, the way Sarah did when her first graders were getting out of hand. But in my case, I did it because my thoughts were getting out of hand. And, of course, because I was worried about Lucy's claustrophobia getting out of hand. Everyone turned to look at me. I stood there like a monolith, waiting for inspiration to strike. "Okay," I chirped, for lack of anything else to say. The situation we were in called for some kind of camaraderie, didn't it? I rooted around in one of the bags at my feet and pulled out a Christmas-themed quilt. "Okay," I said again, letting the folds of the blanket fall open. "I don't know about you, but if I'm going to be stuck in here for a while, I think I'll make myself comfortable." I shoved my cart into the corner of the tiny space, pushing my 2 bags up against the wall, and spread the blanket on the tiles. If Mom knew I was defiling one of her precious Christmas quilts this way, she'd be fit to be tied. I'd have to get it cleaned before I took it home again. I removed my red coat, draped it carefully over the handle of my cart, and lowered myself to sit cross-legged on the quilt, glad I'd opted for warm black leggings under my skirt rather than the lacy snowflake stockings I'd considered. They hadn't been exactly sheer, but they were definitely not the sit-on-the-ground-with-your-legs crisscrossed kind either. Then I indicated the space around me. "Anyone who wants to get off their feet is more than welcome to sit on my blanket." I peered up at August. "Even you, Mr. Jones?" Lucy hesitated only a moment, but when Itsy tugged on her hand, the mother and daughter joined me, Lucy slipping out of her coat and folding it into a makeshift cushion to sit on. Poor thing, she really had no padding anywhere, and the red turtleneck sweater dress she wore hugged every angular line of her distended figure. She stretched her legs out in front of her, crossed her ankles, and released a small sigh of what I can only guess was relief from getting off her feet. "You want your coat off, baby?" she asked her daughter, reaching for the purple toggle buttons.
"No."
Itsy shook her head vehemently.
"It's my new one,"
she said, explanation enough in her mind. August, however, remained standing, and I told myself not to take it personally. He obviously took a little while to warm up to strangers. Not a condition I suffered from. "Do you want to call Sean again?" I asked. It had been a good 15 minutes since Lucy left the message. She nodded but didn't speak. Although she looked a little more relaxed, she was definitely sweating, and her face had a pasty tinge to it. Maybe I should call Sean myself. Actually, let me try my sister first, see if she got a hold of him. Killed 2 birds with 1 stone. I was also a little concerned that she hadn't gotten back to me. Hello? Sarah picked up after the second ring. Sarah, it's Gracie. Where have you been? A wave of relief washed over me. I was glad she was all right, but even more relieved to actually connect with someone on the outside. I was seriously considering trying out the 1-800-DAY-DEAD number. Hey, Gracie, sorry I missed your call. I fell asleep in my oatmeal bath and didn't have my phone in there with me. I was just getting ready to call you now. Oatmeal bath? Never mind, I quickly amended. I don't want to know. So here's the deal. We are stuck in the elevator between 2nd and 3rd floor. Yes, I got your messages, she interjected before I could explain the whole situation again. I left a message on Sean's phone, but I think he may have plans for the night. I looked out back to his place and there aren't any lights on out there. I'm pretty sure he's not there, and I already ran down and tried pushing the elevator up button in the hall several times. Obviously, that didn't do anything since you're calling me now. Great, but you stay inside. You're contagious, I reprimanded. Any other suggestions? Did you try opening the gate and closing it again, like I did when the Otis stopped on us? It always works for me. Seriously? I shook my head, even knowing she couldn't see me. You want me to open the door between floors? I tried to keep my voice calm, but the words kept spilling out. What if we all fall out? Sarah laughed on the other end of the line. You're kidding, right? How on earth are you all going to fall out? You know what I mean? It's dangerous. I was glad the others couldn't hear Sarah mock me. It didn't really bother me when she did, and I gave as good as I got in other ways. But I didn't like it when she poked at me in front of other people. She was one of the few people who could actually make me feel small. Yes, you're right, she conceded. If you're not careful, it could be dangerous. But I know you, Gracie. You're steady as a rock. Suck it up and get her done. And that was why it didn't bother me. Underneath the ribbing and poking, I knew Sarah loved me and believed in me. Hey, did Mom send over some of her stuffed artichoke salad? I've been craving it all day. I had the fleeting urge to clap my hands into the phone to drag her attention back to the situation at hand. Really? We're trapped in this stupid elevator, and all you can think about is Mom's artichoke salad? I glanced over at Lucy again. Her breathing was shallow. Her chest was now rising and falling rapidly. She looked on the verge of hyperventilating. I wondered if there might be a paper bag in any of my stuff. How long ago did you call Sean? I just got off the phone with his voicemail right before you called. She released a huff of breath. Hurry up, Gracie, I'm starving. I pulled the phone from my ear, staring incredulously at it. Are you serious? I asked, with it held out in front of me. Bringing it close again, I said, I'm hanging up now, Sarah. I'm going to try calling Sean again. If he rescues us from this pit of despair, I'll bring you your figgy pudding. If we haven't eaten it all, or each other for that matter, just to stay alive in here. I figured the other 3 could survive off my body for months. You know, if things got really desperate. I swiped the phone off, and seemingly of its own accord, my gaze drifted up to August. He stood a little stiffly, his back to the wall, eyes closed, but one side of his mouth hitched up in a crooked, dare I say, appreciative grin. So he thought I was clever. This time, the flush didn't creep. It rushed through me. I ducked my head, letting my chin-length hair fall forward to hide my blush, just in case he happened to look at me. I scrolled back to Sean's number and hit the call button. To my utter amazement, someone answered on the other end of the line. Ho, ho, ho! A guy hollered into my ear, making me wince. Sean? I asked, the hope in my voice alerting the others. "Santa Sean here, what's up?" Great. From the sounds in the background, he was already celebrating Christmas in a big way. "Oh, good. My name is Grace. I'm calling from Pemberton Manor. My sister lives in apartment 3A. Sarah Winters? Look, we're in the elevator and we're stuck between the second and third floor. Can you come get us out, or maybe give us some hint as to how to get this elevator moving again?" "Yo, who is this?" Sean hollered louder, and I pulled the phone a few inches from my ear. "Grace Winters. My sister is Sarah Winters in apartment 3A. I raised my voice, too. "Sorry, wrong number," he said, and hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, my eyes wide with disbelief, then looked over at Lucy. "He hung up on me," I announced. "He said I had a wrong number." She rolled her eyes and held out her trembling hand. "Let me try." I didn't know what power she might wield that I didn't, but if it distracted her, even for a minute or two, she could have a go at Sean. I handed over my phone, rather disenchanted by the seemingly apathetic and unhelpful men around me tonight. Although I was beginning to warm up to August, at least to his smile, he still remained distant and separate, even though he stood no more than 3 feet from Lucy's crossed ankles. He might as well have been across a stadium from us for all the assistance he'd been tonight. And now Sean. "Sean, this is Lucy Farnsworth," Itzy's mother said into the phone. She covered her other ear and raised her voice. "It's Lucy from apartment 3C. Another pause. "Yes, Pemberton Manor, 3C. Now she sounded a little disgusted. "I'm calling from inside the elevator. We're stuck between the second and third floors. I know you're busy, but we're stuck, Sean. We need you to come and get us out." Another pause, during which she squeezed her eyes shut. She was either in pain or didn't like what she was hearing. "Sean, please. I've got Itzy with me, and there are 2 other people in here with us. It's crowded and getting a little hot and stuffy in here." She grimaced in my direction as though to apologize for her exaggeration. I was really quite comfortable, but I nodded encouragingly anyway. She was sweating enough for the both of us. She paused and listened again. "Okay, fine, but please call this number back when you know, okay?" She hung up and handed the phone to me, her forehead lined with anxiety. "He said it's his night off, but he's calling his uncle, the guy who owns the place." Family ties. Sarah had been right. "So is Mr. Uncle going to call us?" I was a little concerned that Sean might not bother calling his uncle at all, but I wasn't going to go there just yet.
"Mr. Uncle," Itzy repeated, giggling. "You're silly, Grace. Mr. Uncle."
I smiled at her, appreciating her innate ability to lighten the tension a little. Lucy squeezed her eyes shut. "Sean said he'd call him and then call us back." "Perhaps we should call 911 instead," August said, his perfect diction and high-class phrasing beginning to rub me the wrong way a little. It felt insincere, or like he was talking down to us, even with that flamethrower smile. Regardless, I actually agreed with him. Why should we be stuck in this elevator waiting for party boy Sean to find someone to free us? I started to nod, but Lucy straightened and shook her head. "No, please. Can we just wait a few more minutes and see if Sean calls us back? It's just that we—" She faltered to a stop. "What's wrong?" I asked, laying a hand on her arm. "It's just that we already called 911 the last time we got stuck." She sighed wearily. "When Sean didn't answer his phone, I basically panicked and called them instead of waiting for him." She shrugged a bony shoulder. I was told that the next time I called 911 about the elevator without giving him a chance to fix it, I'd have to pay the bill. I can't afford that." She waved her hands in front of her face in a vain attempt to cool her heated skin. I caught a faint musky odor emanating off of her, one that made me think of stress and fear. Poor thing, she was about at the end of her rope. Then again, you'd think she'd think twice about getting on the old Otis ever again. "Certainly, I totally understand," I said. "I don't mind waiting a little longer if that's what you want. My sister will keep trying on her end, too." Then I remembered Sarah's suggestion. She said sometimes opening and closing the cage resets things. It came out more of a question. "We can try it," Lucy said, her voice cracking, making her sound far older than her years. "It didn't work for us the last time, but I'm game." She started to rise, but I put out a hand to stay her. "I'll do it. Sit tight. You too, Itsy," I said when the child got to her feet with me. "I don't want you too close to the open door, okay?" Smoothing out my skirt, I chanced another look at August. I wasn't going to ask for his help. If he was any kind of a gentleman, he'd be jumping at the task already. He wasn't even looking at us, but studying the floor at his feet. Another wave of disdain washed over me. What was wrong with men these days? My mother liked to say it was our own fault, that we modern independent women had convinced men we no longer needed them, so we had no right to complain when they didn't ride in on their white horses to save the day. But I'd never once in my entire life whined about a man holding a door for me or offering his help just because I was a woman. I actually liked being looked after. Clearly, August and I didn't think alike on the matter. I released a breath of disappointment, knowing he wouldn't even notice, and stepped toward the gate. "Actually, Itsy," I beckoned the girl over. "You can help me after all. Can you just hold on to the crank handle?" Itsy scurried to the crank and gripped it with both hands, thrilled at being called into duty. She was really quite a charming creature, with her huge brown eyes and pink cheeks under all that pale hair. "Keep it straight up while I open and close this gate, okay? I don't want to start going up or down while the door is open." I shuddered involuntarily, but instead of letting thoughts of plummeting elevators run rampant through my mind, I forced myself to think about stepping backward onto August's right foot, just to even things out. I opened and closed the accordion door twice. Both times proved unsuccessful in resetting the gears. I glanced over at August in the vain hope that he'd step up and be a man, just this once. Nope. He just stared at the ground, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat again. I sighed heavily, took Itzy's hand, and we headed back to our seats on the blanket. Lucy looked downright ill. "I'm worried about you." I knelt close beside her and murmured quietly, not wanting to upset Itsy, who had plopped down on her mother's other side. "Is there anything I can do to help make you more comfortable?" I just have to figure out how to keep it together," Lucy whispered, opening her eyes to look at me. I was taken aback by the panic I saw in them. "I can do this. I have to do this." She pinched the bridge of her nose and then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, every nervous gesture done with trembling hands. "My heart's racing," she admitted, shooting me a shaky smile. She blew out a few shallow breaths between pursed lips. "Have you ever stood in the middle of a field of wildflowers?" Chapter 5. The question came out of nowhere, and all three of us turned abruptly to stare up at August. I opened my mouth, but closed it again, having no idea what to say. He continued anyway, not waiting for a response. "There's a place north of here in Antelope Valley, a wildflower preserve. Every year, from late February to about the middle of May, for as far as the eye can see, is an ocean of orange California poppies and yellow coreopsis and cream cups, broken up by purple lupines and owl clover. And because it's out in the desert, there's no smog, only a crystal blue sky domed over you, creating this pristine backdrop for the vibrant hues of the flowers. He withdrew one hand from his pocket and fluttered his fingers like he was playing arpeggios on a piano. When the wind sweeps across the fields, the flowers ripple and sway, turning to watercolors before your eyes. As he spoke in that soft, cultured way of his, I found I could almost see the poppies and lupines, the desert grasses, the snow-globe sky, even though I'd never experienced it in real life. It suddenly occurred to me what he was doing, distracting Lucy, giving her something to focus on besides the tiny, cramped room where we were trapped.
I want to see the wild puppies.
Itzy's breathy words were filled with awe. "Not puppies, honey," Lucy whispered, attentive to her child even in her state of barely checked panic. I covered my mouth to hide my grin. "Poppies, they're orange wildflowers."
I want to see the wild puppies, too, Itzy said agreeably.
"Close your eyes, Miss Itzy," August instructed. "Sometimes we have to close our eyes so we can see better."
"But when it's dark, I can't see better," Itzy contradicted. "And I don't like it when it's dark."
"You and me both, kid. I didn't close my eyes." "Only if you're trying to see out." August paused, as though searching for the words that would help Itzy understand. "Instead of trying to look out, try looking in at the pictures you already have in your mind. Have you ever been to a movie?"
"I like movies."
"Well, they turn the lights off so it's dark in the theater, to help you see the movie better, right? So when you close your eyes, it's like turning off the theater lights to help you see the movie in your mind better. Just try it." His eyes were also closed, so I watched him openly, moved by this unexpected glimpse of character. The look on his face told me he, too, was standing out in the field of wildflowers he'd painted for Lucy, for Itzy, for me. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, trying to find middle ground for my emotional response to this enigmatic man. He obviously wasn't completely indifferent to the situation, to what each of us was going through. So maybe he, too, was dealing with some internal struggle and just didn't know how to express himself to strangers. I felt a subtle pricking of guilt at the back of my throat and swallowed hard. Maybe I was passing judgment too harshly. I was accustomed to guys like my brothers who lived out loud and often without enough reservation. August was inarguably of a different breed, so it really wasn't fair for me to hold him to the same standard, was it? Both Lucy and Itzy had their eyes closed now, and the little girl nodded enthusiastically.
"I can see Cinderella dancing in the wild poppies," she exclaimed.
She leaned into her mother's side and draped an arm over the bulge that was Ollie.
"What can you see in your mind movie, Mommy?"
Lucy smoothed her hand over her daughter's hair. She seemed calmer to me already. "I can see you, Princess Itzy, in your favorite blue dress, dancing with Cinderella and picking armfuls of wildflowers. And singing, of course." Lucy smiled gently, making me smile too.
"As loud as I want?"
Itzy's eyes popped open, and she put a hand on Lucy's cheek in a gesture so intimate I had to swallow the lump that rose to my throat.
"I don't have to be quiet?"
"As loud as you want," Lucy assured her, pressing her cheek into her daughter's palm. "No one will tell you to be quiet in the wildflower field." Something in the words made my heart skip a beat. I thought I heard a combination of both relief and regret in them, and once again, I found myself wondering about her story. Itsy smiled dreamily and then rested against her mother's stomach.
I love you, Ollie,
she said in a sweet little voice, patting the baby bump.
You can dance with me too.
It was silent for several moments, and I listened to Lucy's breathing slow noticeably in the stillness. Then Itsy straightened, a small frown tugging the corners of her mouth downward.
Mommy, I started seeing movies about mashed potatoes, and now I'm hungry.
I know, baby. Lucy opened her eyes and smiled at her little girl. We'll get out of here soon so we can go eat some for dinner, I promise.
But I'm hungry now, and so is Ollie.
She pressed her ear to her mother's belly.
I can hear his tummy gargling.
Lucy shifted and sat a little more upright, blotches of pink coloring her cheeks. Just be patient, okay? We have to wait for Sean to call us and tell us what to do.
But he will never come,
Itsy bemoaned.
He always takes forever and forever.
Hush, baby. We have to wait. I dashed off a text to Sarah. Any word from Sean? Sarah texted right back. Nada, the lazy bum. I know he's off partying somewhere. Hey, I'm making myself a bowl of soup and a sandwich. I need to eat something with my medication, and I'm already an hour late taking it. Is that okay? I frowned at the phone. We were trapped in a mine shaft, and she was still talking about needing to eat? And I called Dad. He said if we don't hear from Sean soon, he can come over. Which was exactly why I hadn't called him. Like a true gentleman. I shot August a not quite scathing look, which he didn't notice, of course. He would drop everything and come to our rescue, and Christmas Eve family night would have to hit the pause button until he got back. But I didn't want to do that to anyone. Our folks lived more than half an hour away, just outside Midtown in Oak Glen. My thumbs moved quickly. Tell him we'll wait for Sean, and since you're eating, would you mind if I shared some of Mom's mashed potatoes? There's a little girl here named Itsy. She's hungry. I have all this food. Instead of texting her response, Sarah called. I know you can't say anything on your end, so just make conversational noises, okay? Okay. You said the miniature person operating the elevator was also going to the third floor, right? Is it by any chance the little girl from 3C? Yes, I said, wondering where she was going with this. Very pregnant mother? A teeny tiny little thing, all belly? Yes, that's right. Oh, Gracie. Sarah's voice grew soft and tender. I think this is no coincidence. I saw them when they first moved in here a few weeks ago. I took them a plate of welcome cookies. Didn't I tell you about them? I glanced over at Lucy, hoping she couldn't tell we were talking about her. But her eyes were closed again, and she was breathing softly, in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way they taught us to cool down after working out, or like something she might have learned in childbirth classes. Not that I remember, I replied. I don't know their story, not yet anyway. Sarah lowered her voice, and I pressed the phone closer to my ear to hear what she was saying. But when I stopped by, it took her forever to come to the door, and when she finally opened it, I could see she was shaking like a leaf, and her smile was all false bravado. The little girl hid behind her mom until she saw the cookies, Gracie, and then I thought she was going to grab them out of my hand and chow down right there on the spot. I see, I said, hoping Sarah would get to the point quickly. I felt very uncomfortable discussing Lucy and Itsy right in front of them. I'm fine with my soup and sandwich, Gracie. I'm sick. I don't need a big meal. I told Mom that when she offered to send food over, but does she listen? She paused, so I said, No, she doesn't. No, she doesn't, Sarah echoed, because Mom has to feed everyone. So I say we let her. I knew what she was getting at before she continued. Look, I think those two could probably stand a good meal or two, don't you? Well, you're stuck in the elevator with a Christmas feast, Gracie. Excitement bubbled up in her voice, the way it always did when Sarah got a good idea. She may not take it if you just try to give it to her. You know how some people are about handouts and charity. But I bet she wouldn't say no to eating with you. So feed them. Share it all with them. Are you really okay with that? But I didn't have to ask. Her gesture didn't surprise me. I just wished I'd thought of it first. Remember, I'm a teacher, sis. I know what to watch for in my kids, and I know what I saw in the one tiny glimpse I got into that apartment. I'd be amazed if they had anything besides ramen noodles waiting for them at home tonight. My eyes began to sting a little, and I blinked quickly to keep the tears from welling up. You're probably right, I murmured, seeing from a different angle the abundance our family had. I'll bet Mom even sent over paper plates and plastic forks, didn't she? She did, I confirmed, having packed that bag myself. And sparkling apple cider and cups, right? Eggnog? All of the above. Crazy woman. Gotta love her. Sarah chuckled softly. But I seriously won't eat any of it. She broke off and then said, Actually, if you could save me a little bit of the stuffed artichoke salad. Of course, I agreed, before she guilted herself out of her favorite Christmas side dish. Enjoy your meal with them, Gracie, and give them the leftovers too. Don't take no for an answer, okay? And tell Lucy, that's her name, right? Tell Lucy I'll come visit when I'm well. I'll let the folks know where you are if you're not back in time for the movie. But do keep me posted if you hear from Sean, and I'll do the same. She grunted her disgust. The lazy freeloader. I hung up and sat for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. She hasn't heard from Sean, I began, stating the obvious. Lucy just nodded, and August didn't respond at all.
Stupid Sean,
Itzy grumbled. Don't call people names, Itzy.
Sorry, Mommy,
Itzy apologized, fiddling with one of the toggle buttons on her puffy purple coat. I felt only the slightest bit of shame for wholeheartedly agreeing with Itzy when it came to Sean. I looked over at August to include him in the conversation and cleared my throat. Listen, I have a buttload of food in here. I patted the stacked coolers strapped to my luggage cart. Itzy giggled. She cupped a hand around her mouth and leaned close to her mother's stomach again.
Ollie, Grace said but.
Lucy snorted softly, but didn't say anything. She did meet my gaze, though, and something hardened a little there. Was she upset at me for saying but? Or did she already guess where I was going, and was one of those people who thought help was handouts? Sarah, as usual, had read her neighbor right. I pressed on. Oops, sorry, Itzy. I shouldn't have said that word. I have a lot of food in here. I glanced up to find August studying my mouth again. Wow, someone needed to call him on that. Now was not the time, but if we were stuck in this box much longer, I might have to take it upon myself to deliver that talk. It just seemed so out of sync with his otherwise somewhat pretentious airs. I turned back to Lucy and continued. I have a feeling we're going to be stuck in here for a while, and I'm getting hungry. Itzy straightened, her eyes widening in anticipation. Lucy's fingers tightened around the girl's wrist, a motherly gesture I knew all too well. How many times had my mom warned me to keep still with a squeezed arm or shoulder? I'd love it if you, all of you, would share this food with me. My mom makes some of the best mashed potatoes this side of the Rockies, and I know she'd be very proud of me if she knew I'd shared them with others. I winked at Itzy. I really, really, really love these taters, and sometimes sharing them is hard for me.
My mommy loves her mashed potatoes, and she still shares with me all the time,
Itsy said, eyeing me like perhaps I didn't quite measure up as a legit adult if I had a problem with sharing. I thought Lucy probably gave up her own share of their food more often than she could afford to. But you're taking that meal to your sick sister, right? Although she phrased it as a question, Lucy was simply reiterating what I'd told them earlier. I shrugged. That was originally the plan, Mom's plan, I amended. I wagged a hand at the crank on the opposite wall. But getting stuck in this coffin, Lucy supplied. I grinned. The word had popped into my mind, too, but I'd refrained from using it for her sake. Nah, it's not that bad, right? No, I guess not. Lucy shook her head slowly. Well, getting stuck in here with all of you wasn't part of the original plan either. So I can be all upset and cranky,
like that crabby crank over there,
Itsy cut in. For a moment, I thought she was referring to August, and I had to cough a couple of times to disguise an impromptu snort that escaped the moment I realized she was pointing at the actual crank handle on the wall. I reached over and poked her in the nose. Yes, like that crabby crank over there. I, in fact, actually was referring to August. We can be crabby cranks about it, or we can turn this wacky situation into a party and have us a Christmas Eve picnic right here on this Christmas blanket. But your sister, Lucy countered. My sister is sick, and right now, as we speak, she is eating a bowl of vegetable soup and a cheese sandwich. She doesn't want this food, but there's no stopping my mom when it comes to feeding people. I winked at Itsy. There's enough in here to feed an army, and I would have had to eat it all myself or my mom would be sad. She'd know if we threw any of it away. Moms know things like that. Itsy nodded, her eyes wide.
Mommies are kind of like magic.
I really liked this little girl. I could tell Lucy was waffling. I didn't push, but looked up at the man still standing a few feet away. August, how about you? Do you have dinner plans? Or can I tempt you into joining us for a Christmas Eve picnic? A look passed over his features, one that made me frown. Did he not want to lower himself to picnicking on the elevator floor with us? Well, I was going to. I was thinking of taking... His words broke off, and he was clearly at a loss as to how to continue.
Come on, Mr. August,
Itsy said. She pushed up off the ground and turned to face him. Then, to my surprise and admittedly wicked delight, she poked him in the belly. Hard.
You look hungry. You should have a picnic with us.
The man grunted softly in surprise, and I had to duck my head to hide my smile. I'd leave the rest to Itsy. August wouldn't dare tell the child no. Chapter 6. Mom always says that a good meal can bring even the strangest of strangers together. I smiled to myself, thinking that we truly were an oddball lot gathering around our makeshift table. I started unloading my ready-made feast, setting the coolers side by side near where I'd been sitting. I slid the grocery bags close to Lucy. You should find plates, cups, utensils, napkins, all that stuff in there. Knowing Mom, she packed salt and pepper and condiments, too. Lucy withdrew the paper goods and a large bag of Mom's soft dinner rolls. There had to be at least a dozen of them. What on earth had she been thinking, sending so much food for just the two of us sisters? I glanced over my shoulder to see Itsy take August's hand and pull him forward. He moved slowly, keeping his free hand on the railing, almost as though he were still loathed to join in.
Sit here,
she instructed, tugging him down beside her. I looked away so as not to embarrass him. He was clearly ill at ease with the whole situation. From the first cooler, the one Mom had marked hot food with a piece of masking tape, I took out a plastic container of sliced ham and another of roast chicken pieces. Then came one of Mom's vintage white casserole dishes with the blue flowers on the side, the clear lid moist with steam from the still warm mashed potatoes it held. There was cheesy broccoli, somehow still not mushy, Grandma Sue's yummy baked honey mustard carrots, a dish our family preferred over sweet potatoes, corn on the cob still wrapped in tinfoil straight from the roasting pan, and a small tub of stuffing. There never seemed to be enough stuffing to go around. "I think I found the gravy," Lucy said, holding up a thermos. "At least I hope it is. It certainly doesn't look or smell like coffee." She grinned at me, her eyes lit up so she looked like Itsy, and I felt the knots in my shoulders begin to loosen a little. "And it's still piping hot." She continued to root around in the other bag. "Here's the coffee," she said a moment later, setting another thermos aside. "Boy, your Mom sent you prepared, didn't she?" "Enough to feed an army," I said again, moving on to the cooler labeled cold food. Eggnog and sparkling apple cider, deviled eggs and colorful Jell-O squares, a leafy salad with Greek olives, sun-dried tomatoes, and crumbled feta cheese on top, a bowl of mixed nuts, chips, crackers, and a couple of homemade dips. I left the pumpkin pie and the chocolate mousse pie in the cooler for dessert, and I assumed Lucy had done the same with a huge box of assorted cookies and brownies and other Christmas treats I'd seen Mom stuff into one of the bags.
"Cheese on a pig!"
Itsy proclaimed, reaching into the last container I opened. She held aloft the square of cheddar on a toothpick, like it was the Holy Grail. "Special meals in our house always have food on toothpicks," Lucy explained, blushing prettily. "Well then," I chortled, rubbing my hands together and trying to remember which bag I needed. "Aha! Look what I have." I presented Itsy with a clear square container of red and green frilly toothpicks. Extra special, extra fancy toothpicks for an extra special, extra fancy picnic. Itsy stared open-mouthed at them, and then took the case with near reverence.
"They're beautiful, Grace. Your Mom is a bomb."
I laughed out loud at Itsy's delight. "You're right, sweetie. She is the bomb diddly." Even August smiled at that. I blushed. I did, because he really did think I was clever. And that smile. Lucy set the plates out in front of each person while I organized the food in the middle of the blanket. When everything was ready, I sat back and smiled, momentarily overwhelmed by the impromptu feast we were about to enjoy in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Who would have ever imagined we'd be spending Christmas Eve like this?" Lucy said, as though reading my thoughts. She leaned over and gripped my hand tightly in hers. "Thank you." She reached around Itsy and gave August's hand a quick squeeze, too. "I don't know what I would have done if we'd been stuck alone in this thing. You two are our Christmas angels."
"You are an angel too, Mommy,"
Itsy said without guile. "Oh, baby girl, so are you." She hugged her daughter to her side and sniffled. Then she dashed away tears from her eyes and ducked her head. "Sorry," she choked out. "Pregnancy makes me super emotional." I just nodded, not sure my own voice would be steady enough to speak yet, and I didn't have prenatal hormones to blame it on. I ventured a peek at August, and was pleasantly surprised and moved to see his eyes glistening brightly too. "Thank you for letting me join you," August said, his voice soft, careful. "It all smells amazing."
"Can I pray today?"
asked Itsy. Lucy looked up sharply, first at August, then at me, her eyes a little wary. I'm fine with that, I said. August? He swallowed, opened his mouth as though to say something, and then just nodded. Lucy smiled with relief, took her daughter's hand, and nodded at her. Itsy looked at me expectantly. What is it, Itsy? I asked.
Mommy and me always hold hands when we pray. Want to hold hands?
She shoved a little fist under August's hand where it rested on his thigh. His long fingers curled slowly, almost tentatively, around hers. Lucy's hand felt cool and dry when she took mine, and I noted only a slight tremor in her slender fingers, not the shaking I'd seen earlier. I shifted to my right, a little closer to August, so we wouldn't have to stretch to reach each other, and then I offered him my hand. He hesitated just a moment, and then slowly extended his own to take mine. No, not to take my hand. Instead, he extended his in my general direction, palm up, waiting for me to place mine in his. In that moment, I saw what my wide-open eyes hadn't seen before. Could it be? August Jones was blind? The way August practically looked right through me when I first staggered onto the lift. The surprised grunt when I stepped on his toes, when Itsy poked him in the belly. The fumbling hand at my elbow, on my shoulder to steady me, to keep me from surprising him again. The way he'd stood by, seemingly indifferent, aloof, unaware. And yet, not unaware. The calming wildflower visual he'd painted for Lucy, the mind movies, waiting to join us on the blanket until Itsy took him by the hand and led him over. His intense focus on my lips when I spoke, seeing them perhaps not with his eyes, but with his mind, listening closely as I formed each word. Listening, always listening, and with such intense focus. I stared at his large hand, even bigger than my own, and swallowed back the sob that was clawing its way up the back of my throat. His eyes were downcast, as though he was afraid to see my reaction to my new awareness. But how silly. He couldn't see my reaction at all, could he? He could only hear it, feel it, smell it, taste it. My blood pulsed so loudly in my veins I thought my heart might break right out of my rib cage. I placed my hand in his, a frisson of energy skittering up my arm from the place where our palms pressed together. His fingers closed carefully around mine, the same way they had around Itsy's, long and lean, strong, and to my surprise, slightly calloused.
Dear Jesus, Itsy began without preamble, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, but since I don't eat horses, thank you for making Grace and all her food get stuck on the elevator with me and Mommy. And thank you for Mr. August, who smells like a nice man.
She burst into a fit of giggles, almost falling backward before collecting herself to continue.
I mean, thank you for Mr. August, who smiles like a nice man, and for his big, giant hand.
She paused, and I opened my eyes to look at her. She sat staring at August's hand that completely covered her own until Lucy tugged on her other one.
And thank you for Grace's bomb, Mom, and for the cheese on pretty pics, and for olives, and, do you like olives, Jesus?
Itsy, Lucy whispered. Finish up, baby.
Thank you for my Mommy and for Krabby Cranks and for my Ollie, too. He's the best Christmas present ever, isn't he, Mommy?
Yes, he is.
I bet that's what Jesus' Mommy said about him when he was born, right?
Yes, baby, I'm sure she did. I sat still as the innocence of the child across from me filled the tiny space we were in to overflowing. A tear trickled from the corner of my eye, and I let it fall, closing my eyes and seeing it with my mind, feeling its hot track down the curve of my cheekbone to my jawline, where it hovered for a moment, cooling, tickling, and then fell. I could almost hear the faint plop as it landed on the front of my sweater, the sighing noise the cotton fibers made as they swelled to absorb the moisture, the tiny dark circle, the single drop left on the fabric.
And thank you for this food, and for Christmas, and help sick Sarah to get rid of her chicken spots soon, because she might bring us some more yummy cookies then.
If I knew my sister at all, Sarah would be making yummy cookies with Itsy before too long.
And Jesus, thank you for...
She paused, sighing long and loudly.
Thank you for Sean, even though he doesn't help us when we need it, because he gave us 3 seats to live in. He's not stupid after all.
Itsy. But I could hear the smile in Lucy's voice, too.
And now I'm too hungry to think of anything else. So, Merry Christmas, Jesus. Happy birthday.
She opened her eyes wide and peered up at Lucy.
Hey, Mommy, I just remembered that Jesus' birthday is the same day as Christmas. That's incredimus.
Yes, baby, it is pretty incredimus. Lucy leaned over and pressed a kiss on the top of her daughter's head. Are you finished praying?
Oh, yes. Amen, Jesus. Amen.
She said it like she was saying goodbye. Then she pulled her hands free and clapped exuberantly, adding,
Thanks for the meat. Let's eat.
I laughed out loud. I'm pretty sure August did as well. Without thinking, because we prayed this way around our family table too, I squeezed Lucy's and August's hands tightly and murmured my own amen. Lucy returned the gesture before releasing my hand. August, however, held on, and then covered mine with his other one, freed up by Itsy at the end of her enthusiastic prayer. Thank you for offering to share your food with me, he began, his head lowered slightly, his tone formal. But I'm not the easiest person to eat with. No, please, I interjected, shame erupting again inside of me at the assumptions I'd made about him. You're not... I was just... Grace. He squeezed my fingers between his, and then his thumb moved in slow circles over the thin skin on the back of my wrist. Hear me out. I'm not the easiest person to eat with, because it's hard work for me. So I'm happy to share this meal with you, but I'm not going to eat. Please know it's not the food, or the company either, because I couldn't ask for better food or company for Christmas Eve dinner. But August, no. I shook my head, forgetting he couldn't see my reaction. We're not going to let you just sit there and watch us eat. I broke off, embarrassed by my insensitive choice of words. Sit there while we eat. I glanced over at Lucy, glad August couldn't see my reddening cheeks. Right, ladies? Although Lucy was busy preparing a plate of food for Itsy, her stillness indicated she was paying very close attention to how this was playing out. I agree, August, she said, her husky voice soothing, miraculously calm. She didn't look up at him, but kept methodically cutting everything on her daughter's plate into bite-sized pieces. Itsy, in turn, stuck frilly toothpicks into each piece until her plate looked like a bedazzled porcupine.
You have to eat, Mr. August. I heard your tummy gargle, and that means you're hungry.
Itsy patted his thigh with her hand, and I grimaced at the hint of a greasy fingerprint she left behind on his deep russet corduroy pants.
I always make a mess when I eat, but the picks help me be fancy.
She turned abruptly and held up a piece of ham on a toothpick, nearly shoving it up his nose. His nostrils twitched, and he drew back a little. I was duly impressed with his olfactory awareness.
Here, Mr. August, just eat like I do. My mommy will cut your food up for you, and I'll put the fluffle picks in them, and then you can eat everything. Except maybe the jello won't stay on the picks. You might need to use your fingers for that messy stuff.
Problem solved, August. The toothpicks should make it simple, right? Everything I'd thought about him was reshuffling, realigning, resetting. Looks like you're eating Christmas Eve dinner with us after all. August still held my hand between his. I'd been keenly aware the whole time, but I think he'd forgotten about it. With my free one, I reached over and patted his cheek the way I would one of my brothers. He flinched noticeably, the jolt affecting his whole body. "I'm sorry," I said, jerking back, mortified, and attempting to pull my other hand from his grasp. He tightened his hold and didn't let go. There was no immediate evidence of his blindness in his appearance. His eyes were as crystal clear as mine, and he seemed to focus so intently on things, like my mouth. "No worries," he assured me, using that phrase again. He could say it all he wanted, but I was worried. I was the proverbial bull in a china shop most of the time, partly just because of my Amazonian stature, but also because I'd been raised with 4 brothers and an older sister, and there was no room for delicate sensitivities when one was simply trying to hold one's own in our household. I inevitably stepped on toes, made assumptions too quickly, August being a fine case in point, and crossed lines without realizing it, at least not until long after I'd offended someone. So, to not worry where he was concerned? "I just forgot that you don't see it coming. I'm pretty bad about not getting in people's personal space. It comes from being part of a big, loud, physical family." I rolled my eyes and huffed self-consciously. I guess I don't do handle with care very well. August chuckled, but it wasn't an easy sound. "I don't do so well with it either. In fact, I rather loathe the way I'm treated at times, as though I might break, or like I'm incapable of making decisions for myself." "Oh." I stilled, my heartbeat tripping over itself. Did I just do that? Tell you that you were going to eat instead of letting you make your own decision?
You didn't tell him to eat, Grace. I did,
Itsy interjected, waving an olive on a toothpick at me.
I told him to eat his dinner with fancy picks like me.
"No," August assured me. "You didn't, Grace. However, I did see it coming. I saw your hand, I mean." Chapter 7. "Wait, you what?" I tugged hard, freeing my hand from his grasp this time, really unnerved now. "You're not blind, but—" My voice drifted into silence as I laced my fingers together in my lap. I was completely befuddled. "I am able to see, mostly. Things are pretty blurry around the periphery, starting about here." He held his hands about 2 feet apart, which would explain why he hadn't seen my hand reaching out to hold his before we prayed. "I take longer to process things than others," he continued. "I see your hand moving toward me, and part of me knows you're going to touch me, but it takes me a while to comprehend that I'm going to feel it." He lifted his hand very slowly and held it to my cheek the way I'd done to him. "It surprises me only for a moment." He paused and then continued as though uncertain he should admit his next statement. "I'm not accustomed to people touching me." Oh. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what he was saying. And then his last words hit me. "Oh," I said again, a sense of loss washing over me. Not my own, but his. I couldn't imagine living my life without touching and being touched by the people I loved. How lonely he must be.
What do you mean, Mr. August? Itsy asked. Don't you have anyone to hug a lot?
Out of the mouth of babes. Itsy. Lucy's cheeks flamed as she put a shushing finger to her lips. "It's all right, Lucy," August said. "I have an aunt and uncle who hug me, Itsy. Not a lot, but I know they love me." He took a deep breath and cleared his throat, like he was sorting through a myriad of explanations in his head in search of the one that would make the most sense to the child. He planted his hands on his thighs, his thumbs moving slowly back and forth over the corduroy texture of his pants in small circles just above his knees. Perhaps it calmed him somehow? I found myself studying him in a different light, analyzing everything about him. His light brown hair, closely trimmed on the sides and a little longer on the top, was combed back neatly from his face in an old-school Captain America style. He had big ears, but they were perfectly shaped and lay flat against the side of his head. His neck wasn't long, nor was it thick and muscular, but it sloped up like a sturdy tree trunk from beneath the collar of his charcoal wool coat. He'd unbuttoned it after lowering himself to the blanket, and beneath it he had on a navy sweater vest layered over a mustard-hued dress shirt without a tie. Along with his chili pepper pants, it was a rather colorful combination, I thought, considering how conservative he came across, but it worked really well on his long, lean frame. Dapper, I thought to myself. Rather. All he needed was an Al Capone fedora, and he'd be my Ruby Malone's perfect match. The thought brought a new heat to my cheeks. August's hands, though, kept drawing my attention. His tapered fingers splayed elegantly over his knees, his thumbs never ceasing their movements. I held my breath. I could almost hear the chuffing sound they made against the corduroy fabric. His nails were short and even, clean. There was a fine dusting of hair over the backs of his hands, and from beneath the cuff of one sleeve, I could see the links of one of those medical alert bracelets many people wore. "I was in a car accident a few years ago, and I hit my head," August said, using simple words so Itzy would understand, but I could tell he intended the explanation for all of us to hear. "I was badly hurt, and when I left the hospital, I couldn't take care of myself. So my aunt and uncle made room for me in their home so they could help me get well." Itzy offered him a toothpick with a bite-sized hunk of buttered bread on it. "Are you all better now?" she asked. This time, I noticed how deliberate and precise his actions were as he took the morsel from her and nodded slowly at her question. I didn't miss the fact that he was staring fixedly at Itzy's mouth the same way he had mine. Knowing what I did now, it was obvious he was working hard to pay attention to what she said, to process her words correctly, all while trying to physically perform the simple tasks that were expected of him. "I'm much better, but I have a long way to go. Some people think I'm not very smart because I move very slowly and sometimes it takes me a while to answer a question, but every day I feel like I'm doing better at it. There was a time when I just wanted to stay in my bed with the lights off because it hurt my brain even to think." Itzy cocked her head and narrowed her eyes at him.
"Do you still have an owie on your head?"
August grimaced, hesitated, and then nodded. "I have a few scars. My hair covers a really bad one in the back, but perhaps you can see one right here." He pointed at a pale line that bisected his right eyebrow.
"I see it,"
Itzy declared, getting to her knees and shuffling closer to August.
"Where's the one in your hair?"
"Itzy, baby, you need to eat now."
"But, Mommy," Itzy argued, "I had to see his hairy scar."
August chuckled and waved away Lucy's concern. "I don't mind, really. Most people won't talk about my injuries because they're uncomfortable, or they're afraid I'll get uncomfortable. Your daughter's curiosity is rather refreshing," he said quietly. "How about this, Itzy? If you promise to start eating, I'll show you my hairy scar."
"Okay."
She nodded enthusiastically and rose to her feet.
"I want to see it."
August turned a little so his back was toward the girl, which meant he now faced me. This time he looked me in the eyes and held my gaze steady. Something in his expression gave evidence to how vulnerable he was feeling at that moment, as though he were asking me to see past his shortcomings to the man he was inside, because it wasn't a challenge I found in his eyes, but courage and a fierce desire to find his way back to himself, to not give up. I didn't look away. I suddenly didn't think I'd mind being steady as a rock, like Sarah said, for a man like August, a monolith marking safe ground for him, sanctuary. "Give me your fingers," he instructed the child, holding his hand over his shoulder. She placed her tiny one in his, and then he guided it to the back of his head and helped her locate the right spot. "Can you feel it?" he asked. A moment later, Itzy's eyes grew large, and she tugged her hand free. "Owie, ow, ow, Mr. August. That must have hurt a lot," she commiserated. I curled my hands into fists, resisting the urge to ask him to let me feel too. It did. Sometimes it still does. Not on the outside, but sometimes I still get really bad headaches, and I have to go sit in a quiet, dark room and just look at my mind movies. "I like mind movies now," Itzy said, dropping back to her bottom in front of her plate. "And now, when Mommy sends me to my time out, I will have something fun to do instead of just staring at the wall and being mad." I coughed to cover my laugh. Poor Lucy. She was going to have her hands full with that one. "Great. Now I'll have to come up with another way to discipline her, August Jones." "Sorry," August murmured, but his humorous expression lacked contrition. She flashed him a pretty smile of forgiveness. "It's fine, really." She pushed Itzy's plate closer to the girl. "Now eat up, baby." "What about you, August?" I asked. "You need to eat up, too." He hesitated a moment longer, still warring with the idea of eating in front of us. But then he picked up the plate Lucy had set in front of him and slowly, methodically, loaded it up. Although he refused Itzy's offer to have Lucy cut up his food for him, he did allow Itzy to stick frilly toothpicks into anything on his plate that looked remotely bite-sized. Lucy and I joined in, and within a few minutes we were all indulging in some of Mom's finest home-cooked wares. She'd really outdone herself this year. With great care to not be obvious, I studied August as he moved, as he ate, as he interacted with us. His language, his gestures, everything was slow and smooth, deliberate and precise, not pompous and arrogant as I'd originally believed. No, everything he did was with hard-won control and great effort on his part. We ate slowly, savoring the food and quiet conversation, and before long, Itzy curled up on her side and put her head on her mother's lap. "Are you tired, baby?" Lucy asked, smoothing back the hair from the little girl's face. "Only my eyes, Mommy. I'm not ready for bed yet." "No, of course not." Lucy smiled and shifted to give Itzy a little more room to spread out on the blanket beside her, stacking Itzy's plate on top of her own so the girl wouldn't accidentally kick it. "Why don't you rest your eyes for 5 minutes, okay?" "Only for 3 minutes, Mommy, not 5, 'cause I want some of that cream pie for dessert." Itzy smiled sleepily at me and waved a floppy hand toward the coolers. "I think there just might be a cream pie in there with your name on it," I promised. "We'll have dessert as soon as you wake up, okay?" She smiled and let her eyes drift closed. "Yummy, Grace. Your mom's food is delicious." Her word combinations cracked me up. "Thank you, Itzy. I'll be sure and tell her you said so." I sipped the last of my sparkling cider slowly, giving August extra time to finish eating if he needed it. Then I pulled an empty plastic bag out and began stuffing it with used plates and napkins, waving away Lucy's attempts to help. Itzy was out cold, the combined effects of a full belly and the excitement of the events of the day doing her in. August started picking things up, slowly, carefully. "I've got this," I assured him, placing my hand on his forearm to stop him. He didn't exactly flinch that time, but I still felt a minute tremor pass through him at my touch. I'd like to help. He wasn't being pushy, just stating a fact. Nor did he seem to be trying to prove anything. The man clearly just wanted to be useful. "Here." I held the handles of the bag out to him. "Hold this wide for me." Within minutes, the blanket was cleared of trash and the leftovers packaged up and put back in the coolers. "Coffee?" I asked, holding up the thermos. "I'd love a cup," Lucy said, when August didn't immediately respond. "But I'd better hold off for now. I don't know when we'll get out of here, and coffee goes right through me. Not much room in here for a full bladder," she expounded, smoothing a hand over the curve of her belly. "At least he's sleeping now, too, and not step-dancing on my organs." At his request, I poured August a cup and handed it to him, waiting to make sure he had a good hold of it before I let go. It was a narrow path I was treading, trying to help while not treating him like a child. "So, Sean hasn't called back, has he?" Lucy asked, eyeing the phone I'd left sitting on the blanket beside me. I frowned at her, my mind momentarily drawing a complete blank. Then it all came rushing back to me. Oh, geez, no, he never did," I exclaimed, surprised that I'd momentarily forgotten we were all stuck in this tiny elevator until someone showed up to get us out. I pulled up Sean's number, but handed the phone to Lucy to make the call. "Hello!" Sean slurred into the phone when he answered Lucy's call. I could hear him from where I sat a few feet away. "Sean, this is Lucy at Pemberton Manor, calling you from inside the elevator where we've been trapped for an hour now." She'd lost that panicked edge in her voice, but it was now weighted with her frustration. "You were supposed to call us back after you talked to your uncle, remember?" From where I sat, listening to Sean's voice was like listening to a speaking adult in one of the Charlie Brown movies. Although I couldn't make out distinct words, Sean continued to talk loudly from his end of the call, explaining something in great detail to Lucy. Finally, she said, "Okay, fine, but if he isn't here in 15 minutes, I'm calling 911 and the landlord is paying for it." I actually heard him holler, "Wait, just wait, let me call first." Probably because Lucy held the phone about a foot away from her ear in self-preservation. 15 minutes, Sean," Lucy reiterated loudly, and I could tell from her tone of voice that she'd had just about as much of the guy as she could stand. "I have witnesses." Well, the little mouse was a fair bit mighty after all. Good for her. A comfortable silence settled around us, and I found myself thinking that as much as I loved my family and our crazy shindigs, this ranked right up there with one of the strangest yet surprisingly nicest Christmas Eve meals I'd ever partaken of. It wasn't fancy, even with the toothpicks, and we were certainly a ragtag lot, a group of unattached strangers thrown together like this. I couldn't help but think about what we were celebrating, that night so long ago when two people who were little more than strangers themselves were joined together by a heavenly promise, and not much else. Joseph and the very pregnant Mary barely making it into Bethlehem, only to find no one willing to help them out either. I glanced over at Lucy and smiled. Her head was resting against the wall, her eyes closed in surrender. Chapter 8. "Thank you," August murmured quietly, closer to me than I'd expected. It didn't startle me, but my pulse quickened anyway. I met his gaze, and he nodded at the mother and child asleep across from us. "For sharing your meal with us. You've been very kind." If he knew what I'd originally thought of him, he might say differently. I waved away his gratitude. Mom's cooking is too good to waste, and believe me, it would have been wasted on just Sarah and me. This time, August reached out and placed his hand on my arm, and I flinched, but he didn't withdraw. "I've spent the last 2.5 years finding my way back," he began, and I felt my eyes grow wide as he used the words that had come to me earlier. "I've met a lot of people who have come alongside to help me. Some have done it because they were paid to, and some because they must. It's part of their very nature, and they can do nothing but help. Being like this," he cocked his head slightly, just off kilter, "has helped me learn to tell the difference between the two. I see you, Grace, but not just with my eyes. I can tell you're beautiful both inside and out." His fingers stroked the texture of my sweater sleeve, and I couldn't decide if he was comforting me or himself with the motion. Surely he wasn't hitting on me, was he? Even the thought of it, perhaps a pleasing notion any other time, in this moment left me feeling a little deflated. I found I couldn't stomach the idea of him using his and Lucy's circumstances and my soft spot for the downtrodden to manipulate me and my emotions. But the look on his face was so genuine, so transparent. I read no seduction there, no duplicitous intentions, which only served to make him more attractive to me. Oh, me and my fickle feelings. "Sometimes closing your eyes helps you see better," I said, using his words so he'd know I understood what he was saying. He nodded. "And now that I am learning to use what's left of my eyesight, I want to make sure I don't lose that ability to see clearly." His fingertips traced the long line of my radius over the knobby prominence at my wrist, and then followed the blue veins crossing the back of my hand. I turned my hand over and threaded my fingers through his. He sighed and closed his eyes. "This," he whispered a moment later, squeezing my hand, "this is good." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I didn't feel a need for clarification. It was good, sitting together in the magic of the moment, linked together by our hands, and by something unseen that seemed to be drawing us together. We sat that way for a few moments, letting the silence cocoon us in the tiny elevator, the stillness broken only by the sounds of Itzy's waffling snore, one of us changing position, sipping our coffee, or Lucy's gentle coos, as though already comforting her baby boy even in her sleep. It was so peaceful, a magical moment. Was this how the stable felt to the young, scared couple that dark night in Bethlehem? The nighttime shuffling and breathing of dozing animals, the muted murmurings that drifted to them from the overcrowded inn where they'd found no shelter? Had Joseph carefully settled his new bride into a bed of straw, tucked away out of the night wind, and then sat down beside her, taking her hand to give her comfort, courage, and companionship for what was to come? "I'm going to see my father for the first time since the accident," August said, his voice so quiet, for a moment I wasn't sure if he intended for me to hear him. I nodded, afraid if I spoke, I might break the spell that seemed to hover over us. "We'd been fighting," he continued, staring down into his nearly empty insulated coffee cup. "He wanted me to go back to school, to do something with my life. He said that I was an embarrassment to myself." He broke off, took a sip, and sighed softly. Even now, the words were painful, I could see that much. "And to him," he finished. Words no parents should ever speak to his or her child. Oh, August. "He didn't say so out loud, but I heard the words anyway," he clarified. And of course, I lashed back, telling him to stop living vicariously through me and to get his own life. I was doing what I loved. I was working a janitor job cleaning offices at night to support my dreams. I'd go home, crash for several hours, then get up and work on what I really loved, my art. I was illustrating comics and kids' books, hiring myself out for pennies to build up my portfolio, but I loved it. I didn't always love the picky clients, but I loved the spray of color that filled the pages, the lines that streamed from the tips of my pens and pencils, giving breath to flat surfaces. His voice faded away, and I stayed silent. That field of wildflowers he'd painted for us earlier, I wondered if he'd put that image on paper or canvas before. He told me that he wasn't living vicariously through me, but that he'd given everything of himself for me, and I was ungrateful and selfish. August chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound, only irony. As cliché as it may sound, I, of course, went on to tell him that if he was so ashamed of me, that maybe it was time for me to cut and run, to leave and never come back, that I wouldn't care if I ever saw him again. Oh, no. I knew what was coming. He was right. It was utterly cliché in every way. But that didn't make it any less tragic. His response? He said it like a question, but he wasn't asking me. The classic and even more cliché, be careful what you wish for, son. I waited, holding my breath, but his next words surprised me. We sat in angry silence the rest of the way home. He wasn't really talking about me anymore. My mom had passed away a few years before from cancer, and I knew he grieved her loss beyond measure. Don't misunderstand, I grieved her too, but she'd been sick a long time, and I was a guy, and there were girls and cars and living things to somewhat fill the emptiness she left in me. But my father, August shook his head. It was like he died when she did, but he was forced to live because I existed, and in some odd, twisted way, he resented me for it, and I, in turn, resented him because I knew how he really felt. August set his coffee cup down and began stroking the curve of his knee again. Right as we turned onto our street, my father turned to look at me, to say something else, and I told him to shut up and leave me alone, but in much uglier terms. He grimaced at the memory. He hit me, the car swerved out of control, and we veered straight for the street lamp on the corner. That's the last thing I remember. We haven't spoken to or seen each other since. A hot tear dripped off the end of my nose and fell onto my thigh, just missing our clasped hands. I kept my head bowed. I didn't want him to see me crying, especially since he wasn't. I was afraid my tears, those of a complete stranger's, might somehow cheapen his emotions and his experiences. I quickly wiped the moisture away and pointed at his hand on his leg, keeping his attention off me. "Does that help?" I asked. He stared at his fingers, moving as though of their own accord. "I mean, is that like a calming technique? I see you do it a lot." "Touch," he said. Then he held up our locked hands. "It grounds me. I don't know if you noticed, but while standing, I need to have my hand on something. The back of a sofa, the wall, the doorframe, a rail. Otherwise I feel off balance or even adrift. Like if someone were to bump into me, my body wouldn't know which way to fall. Not having anything to hold on to can make me feel like I'm floating or spinning out of control." I must have made a comical face because he grinned and tried again. "Have you ever been drunk?" I cocked my head and tossed him an impish smirk. "That, sir, is none of your business." He nodded sagely. "I'll take that as a maybe. So maybe you'll understand it this way." He emphasized the word maybe both times. I bumped him playfully with my shoulder and felt him squeeze my hand hard, almost like he was holding on so he wouldn't fall over. I opened my mouth to apologize, but he jumped in, probably not wanting to hear it. "It's a lot like when you're drunk, and you have to keep at least one foot on the ground or your head feels like it might just float away." I nodded, but didn't admit to anything. "So touching the wall, holding someone's hand, it's almost like a spatial reference, right?" I asked, a bit overwhelmed by all I took for granted. "Exactly." How simple it was for me to just throw myself around, untethered, unchecked, to hurry, get her done, to run, to dance, to draw. "Can you still draw?" I asked, suddenly afraid of the answer. He didn't respond right away, and that told me more than any words might. Finally, he said, "I haven't tried since the beginning. I'm afraid to." "Oh." "After the accident, I was completely blind for several weeks." He lifted his free hand to cup the back of his head. "The hit I took back here caused major swelling and pressed on my optic nerves, so even though my eyes weren't damaged, my brain couldn't get the messages they were sending it." Oh, wow. I felt a little like I was having that conversation with Sarah earlier, with August doing all the talking and me just making affirming noises. I hoped I didn't sound as impotent as I felt. "You know how it is when you wake up from a bad dream? What's the first thing you do?" he asked. "Scream and call my daddy?" I suggested. The look on his face told me he thought I was kidding. "Right, of course. But after you do that, you open your eyes, right? You turn on the light and look around the room, and you make sure the horrors you were seeing in your dreams haven't followed you into real life." He fell silent just long enough for me to grasp what he was saying. "But you couldn't open your eyes." My voice came out just the slightest bit strangled. A wide band of panic began to tighten around my chest. "Even worse, I could open my eyes. I could reach up and feel that they were wide open. But it didn't make any difference. I was trapped inside the darkness, trapped inside whatever chaos my mind had created while I slept. And even awake, I couldn't escape my dreams. I couldn't escape my fears or my memories as they came back to me like laser beams. It was pretty rough." He nodded his head toward Lucy and Itzy. "That's when I started visualizing and making mind movies out of my memories." Just listening to him talk about the dark like that, the inability to escape, to hit the light switch, to open my eyes, my pulse raced and my hands grew clammy. I studied the tiny cab around us, listing everything I could see to try to calm myself. The cloudy light buzzing over our heads, the crown molding encircling the room, the inset wood panels, the blackened handrail so heavily used over the last 100 years, the crazy vintage carpeting, black background sprinkled generously with jewel-tone flowers that covered the lower half of the walls, the chipped and cracked tile on the floor that could only be real marble by its patina. Breathe in through my nose, out through my mouth. Slow down, slow down. It wasn't helping. I had to change the subject, now. "The blindness wasn't permanent," I said, stating the obvious. Well, that was a start. August made a wry face and shook his head. The longer hair on top fell forward a little with the movement. I wanted to reach up and touch it. "No, but honestly, there have been many times when I wished it had been. Once my sight started coming back, things were so screwed up inside my head that all I wanted to do was crawl into a black hole and lie perfectly still in the dark. I couldn't tell people what I saw. I couldn't read. I couldn't write. It was just a total disconnect. I still feel that way sometimes. It's easy to get overstimulated, and I just have to shut my brain down. It sounds like a lot of work living inside your head, I said, not really thinking about how the words might sound out loud. Sorry, I didn't mean that in a bad way. I squeezed his hand. I didn't take it in a bad way at all. It is hard work, but like I told Itzy, I'm getting better every day. I was fortunate, and I'm grateful. Over time, I've gotten a lot of my vision back, and now I can see the important things. He squeezed my hand and smiled softly. I can see you with your pretty brown hair and red coat, and your sexy toe-crushing boots, and that's something I'm very grateful for. Okay, so maybe he was flirting with me. Just a little. I met his eyes briefly and then glanced down at our clasped hands. Maybe he was flirting a lot with me. Sorry about your tootsies. I giggled guiltily and then admitted, I kinda thought you deserved it. I thought you were being a pompous poof over in the corner. August laughed out loud, startling Itzy in her sleep. She mumbled something in a griping tone, then shifted roughly against Lucy's hip. Lucy must have been exhausted. She didn't even crack open her eyelids. A pompous poof? He asked in a hushed voice, his smile wide and contagious. Chapter 9. Oh, good golly, that smile, that laugh. Pompous, okay. I can see why you might assume that. But what on earth is a poof? I grinned and shrugged one shoulder. Well, by definition, it's a stuffed footstool. But often they're quite decorative, and no one is actually allowed to put their feet on them. So they just sit there looking pretty. I let my voice fade away. And useless, he finished for me. He pressed an open palm over his heart. Ow! Twist the blade a little more, would you? But he was still smiling, so I shrugged again and defended my error in judgment. Yeah, well, you just stood there in the corner, seemingly too high and mighty to get your hands dirty, making us women folk do all the grunt work. I wasn't happy with you. I lifted my chin with a hint of defiance. Ah, but if you recall, you actually did put your foot on me, he said, bumping me with his shoulder. Hard, if I recall. Hey, I already apologized for that. True. And you also said I was pretty. He wasn't looking at me, but the grin stayed on his lips, creating a rather adorable dimple in his left cheek. I what? I cocked my head and let out an unladylike snort. When did I say that? Just now. You said poofs were pretty. Now he was looking at me, at my mouth, in fact. And since you thought I was a poof... I rolled my eyes. You're really reaching for that one. I gave him a sideways glance. I couldn't help wondering how often anyone complimented him on his looks. But you know, August Jones, you actually are a good-looking guy. And not purely decorative, after all. I hoped I wasn't being too forward. He had, after all, called me beautiful inside and out. Thank you, he said, his grin softening. And then he blushed. He actually blushed. I wanted to jump up and do a silly happy dance, but I maintained my composure. I'd hit a soft spot, though, I could tell. I took a sip of my coffee. You could have said something, you know. His eyebrows rose and his expression turned slightly sardonic. Like what? Hey there, ladies, in your late-term pregnancies and your fancy Christmas clothes. I'm just going to stand over here and stare at the ceiling while you attempt to rescue us because I'm incapable of forming a coherent thought inside this brain-damaged skull of mine. "No, that's not what I meant," I said, sticking out my bottom lip like the child I sometimes forgot I no longer was. But I got the point. What could he have said under the circumstances? Short of wearing an "I'm a traumatic brain injury survivor, so don't ask me to jump in and save the day" label on his chest, he'd had no alternative but to endure my scathing looks and disdainful sighs. And regardless of how long it took him to register what my expressions meant, he'd simply borne up under it all, with his head held high and his dignity intact. I wondered how often the guy was wrongly judged by people like me, people who assumed the worst, never realizing that he was trying his best, and succeeding if his progress over the last couple of years was any indication. "Or how about this?" he continued, speaking into my mulling silence. But he was smiling again, the dimple making another appearance. "I'm sorry I can't help right now. I'm too distracted by the bombshell in red who just blew in on an east wind to be of any use to anyone." "Oh, wow. You really like tiny pregnant women, I teased in a low whisper, just in case Lucy, in her red sweater dress, was only pretending to sleep to give us more time alone. But I admit my toes were curling in my boots, and I'm pretty sure even my hair blushed. And the fact that he'd associated me with the practically perfect in every way Mary Poppins didn't hurt either. That he even knew about the magic of east winds at all. August shrugged and nodded. "I do, and they're adorable, guileless daughters. But I've recently discovered that I may have a bit of a thing for women who can, and will, look me in the eye when we're standing face to face." Wait, was he serious? Did he just say he might have a thing for me? He waited until I met his gaze again. "It doesn't happen very often these days, and I appreciate that you're not afraid of me." "Of course I'm not afraid of you," I declared, wanting to put him at ease, needing to put myself at ease and find my balance again. This guy, this August Jones and his off-balanced world was affecting me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I was beginning to kind of like the tilt-a-whirl ride he had me on. "But people are generally afraid of me, Grace. Maybe not of me, but around me. Afraid of making the wrong move. Afraid of hurting me, of scaring me. Afraid of all I've lost, and afraid of what I may never get back." He patted the front of his coat with his free hand. "That's why I wear the earbuds. They let people off the hook. Half the time I'm not listening to anything, but they give people the freedom to not acknowledge me." "There is something deeply wrong with that, August." I frowned, unsettled by the notion that he intentionally isolated himself, not because he didn't want interaction, but to give people permission not to have to interact with him. "It makes me sad that you'd put up a wall to protect others from you. The world is full of monsters, my friend, but you're not one of them." August laughed softly, a little self-deprecatingly, and said, "Leave it to you to see it that way. You waltzed in here and challenged me to step up, and instead of patting me on the head and telling me it was okay, you scowled at me like I wasn't living up to my potential." He chuckled again, and for a moment I wasn't sure if he was still complimenting me or not. Then he jutted his chin in Itzy's direction. "She's the same way, that one. Embracing my limitations rather than trying to look past them. It's rather nice for a change." He took a deep breath and let it out slowly as he met and held my gaze again. "This has been the best Christmas Eve I've had in a long time, Grace. Maybe since before my mom got sick. So again, thank you." "You're welcome." I didn't want to say more. I knew I'd bluster and blather and make us both feel awkward. A moment later, I did add, "I'm not afraid of you, August Jones. And I think I kind of like the way it feels to slow down a little, to take some extra time with things, with life. August smiled and nodded. Well, I've slowed down, that's for certain. But I'm not taking things for granted the way I used to. Every day that I get up and get dressed is an accomplishment. Even the days I don't do so well are much better than my good days were 2 years ago. And hey, I'm working again, and I'm basically independent. He grinned sheepishly at me. But I do still live with my aunt and uncle. Oh, that doesn't bother me, I said, as though he were listing his qualifications for my approval. I blushed a little, but kept on, hoping he hadn't thought anything too presumptuous about my response. I still live with my parents, too, but I don't have your excuse, I said. I'm just the baby of the family, and I'm too spoiled to want to leave. Well, he admitted his issues. I could admit mine. And too scared, I suppose. What are you afraid of? He turned toward me more completely and reached for my other hand. We sat facing each other, legs crossed between us, hands clasped over our bumping knees. You really want to know? It may change your opinion of me. I peered up at him, a little ashamed at how silly my phobia sounded after everything he'd been through. Then I rolled my eyes. I don't think Mary Poppins is afraid of anything. August leaned forward and waited for me to look at him again. You're not Mary Poppins, was all he said. I nodded and gulped, finding comfort in his clear blue gaze. I'm afraid of the dark. It came out in a whisper, as in a paralyzing phobia, borderline pathological. I've been to 6 therapists who all dug furiously to find some traumatic event in my childhood that might be triggering it, but I'm telling you, there's nothing there. I come from a wonderful family. I have parents who love each other and each of us kids fiercely. There's no creepy uncle in the family tree that I know of, and I don't have one of those cousins who charges to view his porn collection at family reunions. I snorted. That was actually my brother Jeff, and he got busted because his porn was just underwear ads in one of my mom's clothing catalogs, and someone cried extortion. August laughed again. I'd like to meet your family. They sound remarkable. But we're talking about you. Ah, I said, raising one eyebrow at him. I see you've spent some time in therapy, too. I couldn't count the times my counselors had drawn my attention back to why I was there, to my problem, to my abnormality that needed to be sorted out. Well, my last shrink wanted to just fix it with pills to dummy me down, but I hated them. I hated the way they made me feel like I was walking through water. They didn't lessen my fear, just lessened my ability to express how afraid I was. Needless to say, I was written up as non-compliant, and I haven't been back. I shrugged. But that leaves me back at square one with the whole living alone thing. I'm completely fine as long as there are night lights and bathroom lights and street lights. 1 candle in the dark is all I need. It gives me something to focus on. August didn't say anything for a few moments, and I wondered if he was trying not to laugh at me. Maybe he was biting back the words I'd heard 1,000 times from family and friends alike. What are you so afraid of, Grace? You're big enough to scare any boogeyman away. Shouldn't you be over being afraid of the dark at your age? Or even worse, perhaps this is a means to get attention, Grace. Sometimes the youngest child will go to great extremes to be noticed. I worked hard not to harbor resentment toward that therapist. I chanced looking up at August again, and was surprised by the compassion in his eyes. What? I asked, embarrassed by his kindness. I get it, I really do. Sometimes you just have to accept the fact that you can't control your fears. Regardless of how real or not the thing is you're afraid of, the fear itself is real. Believe me, I know. He sighed and shook his head. I don't have any answers for you, Grace Winters. I wish I did, but I don't. I wish I could hand you a magic drink or wave a wand and have the fear just vanish, but I can't. And I'm not going to trivialize things by giving you pat suggestions to fix your little problems. The last words he uttered in a slightly sarcastic tone, in a way that made me think he'd dealt with people who had trivialized him and his situation a time or two before. You mean you're not going to add to the melee out of some misguided sense of male obligation? I quipped, teasing him with his own words, wanting to lighten the mood. It was such an overwhelming relief to be able to tell August about my anxiety without him immediately trying to fix me. That alone made me want to be braver. Exactly, he agreed. Was he blushing again? That did make me sound like a bit of a pompous poof, didn't it? A bit? I teased. But then I looked down at our clasped hands and realized that I was feeling grounded by his touch, too. Thank you, August, for not trying to fix me. I'm not broken, and quite frankly, I don't think you are either. We just have our own unique challenges in life. After a moment, he spoke again. The reason I didn't get off on the second floor, Grace, was that I'd changed my mind. I wasn't going to go through with it. Before you ladies got on, I'd been standing in this elevator for what seemed like forever, warring with myself, praying for some kind of a sign that would help me decide what to do. I'd come this far, you understand, and I couldn't make myself take the next step. I'd gotten on expecting a push-button panel, but when I saw the crank, I had no idea how to use it. My mind couldn't grasp it because it was a brand new experience for me. I struggle the worst with new things, he explained. Once I'm shown how to do something, or how something works, I'm fine with it. But problem-solving in unknown territory is a tough one for me. Ah, well, that explained a lot. Why he didn't jump in to help us when the elevator broke down. Why he didn't offer any suggestions. You couldn't take the stairs? Stairs are not fun for me. My depth perception is still a little tricky. I can do them in a pinch, but I rarely try them when I'm alone, just in case. Right. So I stood here waiting. I gave it half an hour. If no one got on, I'd leave. If someone got on and went to the second floor, that was a clear sign to stay and see him. If someone got on and went to the third floor, that meant I could leave. One corner of his mouth hitched up as he continued. If someone got on and accused me of lurking in the elevator, that meant I should leave quickly before the police showed up. If the police showed up, I'd tell them why I was here, and that would be a sign that I needed to stay and see him, because they'd probably escort me directly to his door. I laughed at that, and he chuckled too. I know, call me crazy. Never, I teased. So when Lucy and Itzy got on, and then you, and all 4, he gave a nod at Lucy's belly. 4 of you were going to the third floor. My decision was made for me. I'd take the ride all the way up, watch you operate the crank so I could take myself back down, and head on home. I held my breath, waiting for him to finish, to say he'd changed his mind, still planned to see his father. I wasn't going to tell him what to do, or try to make the decision for him.
I think your daddy would like to see you tonight,
Itzy said in a voice scratchy from sleep, her head still resting on her mother's lap. I released my breath and smiled over at her, withdrawing my hands from August as nonchalantly as I could, but I didn't move away. I liked the way our toes met and our knees butted up against each other.
He's probably a nice man like you, Mr. August, Itzy added confidently.
Chapter 10. He is a nice man, August assured her after a moment. In spite of the memories he'd just shared with me, August said it as though he truly believed it.
Maybe you got stuck in the elevator so you wouldn't run away, Itsy continued.
Itsy, Lucy murmured, her hand drifting slowly up and down the girl's back. So she was awake. I wondered how long she'd been listening. It's all right, August told Lucy again. And you're probably right about getting stuck, Itsy. I nudged him with my knee, making him sway a bit. So this is your fault. He grinned sheepishly, but he didn't deny it. Maybe so. Are you going to see him? Lucy asked, the rasp in her voice sounding just the way it always did. Maybe she hadn't been sleeping at all. Had she heard everything? August nodded slowly, his voice firm, determined. I am, Lucy. Yes. As soon as we get out of this thing. Then I think it's time for dessert, I declared. We need to celebrate. Itsy popped up and clapped her little hands. I'll try calling Sean once more while you guys get the pies out. Sounds like a plan, August said, shifting around so he faced away from me again. What can I do to help? He asked. Lucy handed him a pile of paper plates and forks, and while I listened to the phone ring repeatedly, he slowly, methodically prepared a setting in front of each of us. Sean, your 15 minutes were up 15 minutes ago, I quipped into the phone, not bothering to remind Sean's message box of who I was. I hung up and sighed. Let's have our dessert first, then I'll call 911. But before we could get the pie served up and a fresh round of coffee poured, Itsy started tugging on Lucy's sleeve.
I need to go potty, Mommy, she whispered.
From the lack of surprise on Lucy's face, I could tell she'd been expecting this dilemma. I'd spent enough time in Sarah's classroom with her to know that when a child that age acknowledged the need for a bathroom, straits were already bordering on dire, and Itsy was definitely doing a quirky little potty dance. You're going to have to hold it, baby, just a little longer, okay?
I don't think I can,
Itsy whimpered. I'll call 911 now. I slid my phone open, anger at Sean's ineptitude tearing a hole in the happy bubble I'd been in. Hold up, August said. He stood, slowly, carefully, using the handrail, but not to pull himself up, I now saw, rather to give him that spatial awareness he'd talked about. I was fascinated by him, by everything he did, every deliberate movement he made. I'm going to try your sister's suggestion one more time, he announced, once he'd reached his full height and began to move around the wall to the gate latch. I think I can manage it now that I've seen you do it, Grace. He turned to Itsy. Can you hold the crank steady for me? The child nodded and took her position, squirming impatiently the whole time. August studied the metal accordion door, the sliding latch that locked it in place, the release lever at his foot. I resisted the urge to tell him to hurry for Itsy's sake. It would do no one any good. Finally, he gripped the latch and pulled, sliding the door open, making it screech in protest. Then he slammed it shut again, perhaps with a little more vehemence than necessary. I jumped. Lucy put her hand to her chest and giggled. Okay, Itsy, August said. Try the crank. With a shudder and a lurch, the crazy old Otis took a ratchety breath and shimmied us up the shaft to the 3rd floor. I sat stunned and so proud of August. Lucy clambered to her feet, slipped her arms back into her coat, and dug in her purse for her keys. I'm so sorry to rush out like this. I'll just let her in the apartment, then I'll be right back to help clean up. Stop it, I demanded, shaking my head. Get her to the potty. August stepped aside and let Lucy throw open the door this time, watching as she released the safety mechanism on the 3rd floor security door, and then she and Itsy dashed out into the softly lit hall. Hurry, Mommy, hurry! I heard Itsy plead as they disappeared inside their apartment. I turned to August and smiled, suddenly shy, the surreal nature of our situation settling around me. "Wow," I said, at a complete loss. "That was weird." August shifted his weight and stepped closer to the wall, his hand on the rail again. Maybe, or not. He scanned the mild disarray of the tiny elevator cab. "Let me help you clean up." He picked up the bag we'd used for trash and held it open for me. "Oh, sure, okay." I gathered up the unused paper plates and forks and tucked them in the cooler along with the uneaten desserts, and then scooped up our empty cups and shoved them in the trash bag. Then I stepped out into the hall and shook out the blanket, figuring Sean deserved to have to vacuum up our crumbs, before folding the pretty quilt back up and setting it on top of the coolers August had restacked on my luggage cart. There wasn't really much more to do. He picked up my coat and held it out for me. I stepped closer, turned, and let him help me put it on. He might have taken a little longer than was absolutely necessary, straightening the draped fabric over my shoulders. I turned to face him, not moving back, staying in the circle of his personal space, him in mine. "I think what you're doing is incredibly brave. May I hug you?" I asked, not wanting to surprise him, not wanting to scare him away. There was almost no hesitation, no pause in which to process my request. He wrapped his arms around me and pulled me the last few inches into him. He smelled like dry cleaning and aftershave, a crisp combination that seared itself in my mind and made me want to bury my nose against his neck and breathe in the scent of him until my lungs could hold no more. He was built so differently from the men in my family, where they were big and bulky, thick-torsoed, rough and tumbled. August was tall and lean, solid, but with a wiry frame that, for just a moment, felt insurmountably foreign pressed against me. I felt him shudder the tiniest bit when I slid my arms around his waist inside his open coat and rested my cheek on his shoulder. It was perhaps too intimate, too bold, but I didn't care. My boots might have made me an inch taller than he was, but as I stepped into him, we somehow seemed to lock into each other, his hard planes bending to accommodate my feminine curves, my solidness and substance an anchor for him to cling to. He wasn't holding on to the railing. "Are you doing okay?" I asked, not lifting my head. "Do you feel like you're floating?" I sure did, but for different reasons altogether. August took a few moments to reply, but one hand drifted up and down my back in a smooth, repetitive motion. Was he nervous? Or was he trying to soothe me? "This is the most grounding touch of all," he finally murmured, his mouth close to my ear, his breath warm on my back. "Being held like this is tight and close. My physical therapist is this huge mountain of a man. When I get overstimulated or overwhelmed, he steps up behind me and wraps his bear-like arms around me and just full-body hugs me until I get myself under control again. It's remarkable how effective a sturdy hug can be." I closed my eyes and pictured August being held tightly, securely by some large, hairy, bare-faced man. The image made me giggle, and I turned my face into his coat to muffle the sound. As though he'd read my thoughts, he laughed too. "This is much better, I assure you, being held by you." "I agree." It occurred to me then that I hadn't pictured August being crushed by the bear man, or being mauled by a real bear, or worse, as my imagination was wont to do. Interesting, I thought to myself. Maybe there was something to this whole touch thing. I finally pulled back a little, but still didn't meet his gaze. "I suppose we should get all my junk out of here and send you on your way." August didn't let go. "Actually, I'm fine right where I am," he said. "Are you sure you have to meet your sister tonight?" "Unhand me, you cad." I laughed, blushing and a good bit giddy. I pushed against his chest. He released me, but let his palms skim down my arms to my hands as I stepped back. I eyed the coolers still packed with food, the canvas bags still stuffed with more paper plates and napkins and paper towels. "I'm giving it all to Lucy." "Of course you are," he said, releasing my hands. Instead of taking the railing, he gripped the handle of my cart. "I'll help you take it down to her apartment." I almost agreed, thrilled to prolong our time together in any way we could. I didn't want to say goodbye to him tonight. Not ever. But something in his voice made me pause. "August?" "I've got this. You go see your dad." I covered his hand with my own, then angled the cart away from him. "Don't wait. Don't put it off." I picked up the 2 canvas bags and slung both of them over one shoulder. They were much lighter now. I can manage. August stood quietly, swaying just the slightest bit. I saw in his eyes the doubt that still lingered. I knew he was doing the hardest thing he'd ever done, coming here, and I couldn't bear to be any part of his reason or excuse for not following through. And he needed to go now, before Lucy and Itzy returned, lest they become another reason to delay. I knew without a doubt there'd be a long discussion over her taking the food, and unless I'd read her wrong, she'd invite us in for the dessert we'd missed out on. No, he needed to go now. Finally, he reached for the railing and moved toward the crank. I stepped out of the elevator and turned back to face him. "I want to hear all about it," I told him, stubbornly ignoring the little voice in my head that told me I was being a silly romantic fool, that this beautiful man and I would never cross paths again after the Otis elevator took him away. I swallowed hard and insisted, "I want to hear every detail." He nodded slowly, and I opened my mouth to say goodbye, but a swift, breath-snagging wave of déjà vu crashed over me, and I wanted to wrap my arms around myself. Was this my destiny, to always have to say goodbye? To Calvin? To August? Who else? Who next? And how many more moments, minutes, hours of happiness would I be willing to endure before saying goodbye again became more than I could take? I recalled, as though it were yesterday, standing in the lobby of the airport with Calvin, stepping out of the solid embrace of a large, handsome man who had clearly enjoyed holding me, too. I'd wanted him to stay, to change his mind, to postpone his trip home, to at least give me some kind of hope, even if it was false, that he'd come back to me. Here I stood again. Wash, rinse, repeat. But now it was August I watched, August I was saying goodbye to. How desperately I wanted him to leap forward, to fly off that elevator and sweep me up in his arms. I almost laughed out loud at the thought. August would not be leaping or flying any time soon. Not toward me, not toward anyone. But one step in my direction would be enough to give me hope. He said, "Tell Lucy and Itzy Merry Christmas for me." "I will. Now go." I stepped out of the way of the security door, my eyes never leaving his, while it started to swing back into place. Just before it closed, I lifted my hand and blew him a kiss. I couldn't tell if it registered or not. Chapter 11. "Lucy, I'm home," I called out, doing a terrible Ricky Ricardo as I pushed my way into Sarah's apartment, dragging my cart of nearly empty coolers behind me. But I smiled at the thought of the other Lucy I'd just left with a counter full of food and other sundry items to sort through and stock her fridge and pantry with. I'd kept the stuffed artichoke salad for Sarah, as promised, but Lucy had also insisted I keep the leftover mashed potatoes and gravy, claiming she'd already made some for her and Itzy. I was secretly relieved. Out of everything in the coolers, Mom's mashed potatoes and gravy were my favorite. I'd choose a bowl of them over a bowl of ice cream in front of the television every time. Besides, I'd need comfort food later, I was fairly certain. After the movie, which was in full swing, was over, after Sarah's living room was straightened and my bag of gifts was emptied out under her funny little Charlie Brown Christmas tree, after she'd gone to bed in a well-medicated stupor, I'd be left alone with my thoughts of August. It wasn't until after the doors had closed that I realized we hadn't exchanged contact information. Sarah rose up from her sofa and held aloft the tablet in her hand, pointing its camera in my direction. Cries of welcome and an assortment of rude male noises greeted me. My adult brothers still clung to the childish tradition of greeting me in belches, something that used to embarrass me beyond measure, and now only embarrassed them, except not one of them seemed to realize it. Sarah told the family she'd call back in a bit, closed the video chat session, and set the tablet down on the coffee table. She circled the couch and came forward to greet me. "I won't hug you," she promised. "Ew, no." I wrinkled my nose in mock horror as she drew near. She didn't look so bad, really. The worst of the pox were on her torso, and only a few marks spotted her pretty face and bare neck. She had her hair pulled up in a ponytail and wore loose flannel pajamas. I could tell by the way she moved, however, that she was uncomfortable. "I brought you stuffed artichoke salad and mashed potatoes." "You didn't give them the food?" "I did," I assured her. "But Lucy made me take the potatoes, and I promised you the artichokes." I reached out and touched her cheek in greeting. "Merry Christmas, sicko." "Merry Christmas to you, too," she said, grabbing my wrist and squeezing it. "I'm glad you made it. I feel like crap, but being alone tonight would have stunk." I slipped out of my coat, draped it over the back of a dinette set chair, and smiled sadly at the red folds. I would always think of August from now on whenever I wore it. How gentlemanly he'd been, holding it open for me. How tenderly he'd settled it around my shoulders. How he'd called me a bombshell in red. I pulled the chair out and dropped into it, unzipping first one boot, then the other, and sliding my feet out of them. With a sigh of relief, I stretched my legs straight out in front of me, curled my toes, and rotated my ankles. Wow, it feels good to get these big old tootsies out of those pointy-toed witch shoes. August had called them sexy. Toe-crushing, yes, but sexy nonetheless. In the little kitchenette, Sarah began making herself a cup of tea. "Hot toddy?" I teased, knowing full well my sister was a teetotaler. "Even better. This is a jasmine tea blend I got from that herb shop out by Mom and Dad's. Nettles and Nests? The proprietor there will whip you up a tea for anything. This one has jasmine, ginger, lemon balm, and probably a few other things in it too. I just add a little honey and I've been drinking it all week. I swear it's the reason I haven't had a worse case." "That's cool. Think she can whip up a tea for a bruised heart?" I asked, laughing weakly. I pressed the heel of my hand to my sternum, hating how pitiful I sounded. I think I hurt myself in the elevator. Sarah turned away from the stovetop and eyed me with a knowing look that told me she'd heard more than what I'd said out loud. "Really? Was there also a man in the elevator with you and Lucy and Itzy? Was I that transparent?" "Maybe." Sarah snorted and shook her head. "Who was it? The guy in 2C? Watch out for him. He's a ladies' man." The way her voice hitched a little gave me pause. "Really?" I said, sounding just like she had a moment ago. And how do you know this about Mr. 2C? Sarah waved a hand dismissively and went back to work on her tea. Oh, please, Gracie. I know everyone in this building. I make it my business to know who I live with. But we're talking about you. Was it Kyle? You know everyone here? Do you know the man in 2A, an older guy, probably in his 50s or older? Sarah turned again to look at me, her brow furrowed. You rode in the elevator with Harvey. He took the Otis? I shook my head. Not him. His son, August Jones. Wait, what? Sarah was clearly having trouble making sense of what I was saying. She shook her head. You must have gotten things mixed up. I don't think Harvey has any family, and I sincerely doubt he'd ever take the elevator. He told me the thing broke down on him the very first time he got in it. He was trapped inside it for almost 3 hours, and he hasn't used it since. She shrugged as if to say he was the one missing out. He didn't want to even try my special trick. How do you know this stuff about people? I asked. Maybe it was because Sarah was a teacher, or perhaps because she was the oldest child of 6 and had always been a little caretaker busybody. But regardless of how she orchestrated it, Sarah always seemed to have the inside scoop on everyone she met. She shrugged. I'd just come home one afternoon and he walked into the building behind me. I got in the lift expecting him to join me, so when he headed for the stairs, I called out to him, thinking maybe he didn't want to make me feel uncomfortable riding in that tiny space with him. She took a sip of her steaming beverage and sighed pleasurably. He's a diesel mechanic or something. Greasy, dirty. You know the type. Looks good on a male model, not so much on a beanpole 50-something-year-old with thinning hair and drooping shoulders. He seemed sad, though, and I thought he might appreciate the company. I need to call Sean, I said, suddenly wanting to change the subject. The bruise in my heart throbbed painfully with the image Sarah painted of August's father. Call Sean? Why? Sarah asked, her brows furrowed in confusion. Didn't you just see him? No, he never came, never even called back. I twisted in my chair and rooted around in the pockets of my coat, pulling out my phone. Spurred on by Itzy's desperate potty dance, August tried your door trick again, and for some reason, it worked for him. Ha, I knew it. No big deal, right? It didn't work for me. I tried it a couple of times. She waved my excuses away. You just gave up too soon. Then she wiggled her eyebrows at me. There was one nasty pox right between her brows, and when it moved up and down too, I had to look away. Or did it not work on purpose? Like maybe getting trapped in the elevator with August? Is that even his real name? Might have been on purpose? I keyed in my phone's password. Not on purpose. You know I wouldn't do that to myself. And yes, I believe that's his real name. He wore this medical bracelet, and at one point it slipped out past his cuff and I saw his name. I wasn't about to admit to her that we'd been holding hands at the time. I'd hear no end of it. Kinda cool. I like it. August Jones. She opened the fridge and ducked behind the door to root around inside. You know, if you married him, you'd be Grace Jones. Seems somehow fitting. I raised my hands in an impatient gesture. Why do you even speak, Sarah? If I married a man I just met in an elevator 5 minutes ago? And why on earth would it be fitting if I were Grace Jones? Do you have any filters at all? She straightened, a clear glass bowl of Jell-O in her hands. Grace Jones was that bigger-than-life Zula woman in the Conan movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, remember? Wow, thanks. She closed the fridge and snatched the spoon from her teacup. It's a compliment, Gracie. She was a warrior, one of the good guys, just like you. I still wasn't so sure it was a compliment. I may be an Amazon, but I'm hardly a warrior, I muttered, feeling vulnerable after admitting my deep, dark, literally, secret to a complete stranger. I'm afraid of the dark, remember? So? Sarah pressed. If I remember right, in the movie, Zula was afraid of rats. Well, besides all that, I won't be marrying August Jones. I doubt I'll ever see him again. He didn't even ask for my number. I held up my phone. I do, however, have Sean's number. I'll just give him a call and let him know not to worry about us. Sarah hoisted herself up on the counter, squirted a generous layer of canned whipped cream over the top of the Jell-O, and then scooped out a huge bite of the jiggly stuff. It looked to me like a spoonful of brains. Let him worry. He should. You were stuck in there for over an hour and on Christmas Eve. How much longer would you have been stuck if I didn't know the door trick? She asked, before loudly slurping the spoonful between her lips. I wrinkled my nose. Wow, do you need a nice Chianti with that? I asked. The doorbell buzzed, an old-fashioned jangling sound that I found oddly charming. Surely her deadbeat boyfriend wasn't planning to make an appearance. Are you expecting anyone else? I asked, not bothering to get up. Sarah was closer to the door than I was, and I needed to finish my text. Like this? She squawked, gesturing to her pajamas, her messy hair, her spots. I'm not answering that. You get it. She bustled back around the sofa and dropped into it, slouching down so that only the fountain of her ponytail showed above the back of it. Besides, it's probably Sean coming to spout off some excuse for his ineptitude. That's what he did the last time he was a no-show when my sink disposal fried. Begged me not to report him. Or it's Lucy trying to return some of our food. She may be tiny, but she was starting to scare me just a little when I refused to take any of the pies. I stood and crossed to the door, the old wood flooring cool through the thin socks I wore. I leaned forward to peer through the peephole. August Jones stood outside my sister's apartment, leaning forward just a little, probably keeping his hand planted on the wall to steady himself. I pulled open the door and beamed at the man, hardly daring to even breathe lest he disappear. I opened my mouth to say something, just as Sarah piped up again from behind her padded fortress. Tell him he's a bum, a good-for-nothing slacker who deserves to be sad and alone on Christmas Eve. I saw the span of time it took for her words to register with August. I watched it play out in slow motion, how his eyes widened, how he straightened and swayed just the tiniest bit as he shoved both hands into his coat pockets. I watched as a look of dismay settled on his debonair features, the uncertainty in his blue eyes, his brow furrowed. I watched him the way he might watch me, carefully, methodically dissecting each single movement, each shift in his features, in his stance, taking the time to intentionally process every nuance of his reaction the way he must have to. And I was suddenly overwhelmed by how much I missed, how many tiny details slipped by me unnoticed as I lived my life at my typical warp speed. I was still smiling when I held out my hand to him, wanting to put a stop to the assumptions I could see he was making. She thought you were Sean, I said. Oh, right. He nodded slowly, and then took my hand. His swaying stilled noticeably. Well, that sounds about right to me. And there was that smile again. My bruised heart started doing a happy dance inside my chest. I imagined it probably looked a bit like Itzy's frenetic potty dance. What are you doing here? I asked quietly when he didn't say anything more. What happened with your dad? And the happy dance stilled. Oh no, this could not be good. He wasn't home, or at least he didn't answer my incessant knocking. He probably saw me through his peephole and refused to open the door. August lowered his gaze to my feet and then looked up at my face again. "You're shorter than I remember," he said. "Am not," I teased back, straightening my shoulders and thrusting out my chin. "Maybe you're just taller than you remember." The words came out sounding far more profound than I'd intended. His expression grew thoughtful, but in a good way. Finally, he said, "You know, I feel taller than I remember. Right now, here with you." He squeezed my hand, sending a ripple of something, anticipation? Hope? Through me. It was really quite amazing how much could be communicated through a simple touch. "I almost left, Grace. You can't get more of a closed door than a closed door, right?" He spoke slowly, carefully, almost hesitantly. I sensed it was more because he wasn't sure how his words would be received, rather than because of any physical struggle. But standing in the elevator, I realized that if I left... He stopped, his eyes shifting to look past my shoulder into my sister's apartment. I turned around to see the top half of Sarah's face over the back of the sofa, watching us. Even though I couldn't see her mouth, I could tell she was smiling. Her eyes always curved down when she did. "Ignore her," I said, pulling the door partially closed behind me. I didn't want him to forget what he was going to say. I had a feeling it was something I really wanted to hear. "Your sister?" I nodded, smiling encouragingly at him. "How is she feeling?" "I'm fine. Great," Sarah called in answer. "I'd invite you in, but I'm really hoping Gracie will produce some nieces and nephews for me one day, so I'm not taking any chances. You know what they say about chickenpox and sterility in men and all." I spun and gaped at the back of the sofa. "Sarah!" All that could be seen now was the top of her messy ponytail again. One of her hands shot up and she made a shooing gesture with her spoon. "Out into the hall, you two. It's a hotbed of germs in here." Then she added, "I look forward to meeting you, August." I could tell he was struggling a little to catch up, thank goodness. I took advantage of the moment to compose myself, stepped out into the hall in my stocking feet, and pulled the door all the way closed behind me. "Her boyfriend won't visit her because he's afraid he'll get chickenpox and wind up sterile," I said, hoping my explanation would be enough to make him forget Sarah's obvious alluding to the possibility of the two of us marrying one day, having children. I blushed at how perfectly delightful that sounded to me. "Ah," he nodded. "I see." He lifted his gaze from my mouth to my eyes and smiled. In his expression, I saw clearly that he'd heard and understood everything she'd said, as well as everything she hadn't said. "We wouldn't want that now, would we? She's right, you know. You'd look awfully pretty with a couple of kids clinging to your red coat sleeves." I felt the blush deepen, but I squeezed his hand, desperate now for him to finish what he'd started. "Thank you. You were saying before my sister so rudely interrupted?" "Oh, right." He frowned slightly and pressed his lips together. "Please, please, please, say something that will curl my toes." "I almost left," he began again. "But in the elevator, I realized that if I left, I probably wouldn't come back, at least not for a very long time." His free hand lifted, like he was going to touch my face, but he must have changed his mind. I breathed out slowly so he wouldn't know how badly I'd wanted him to. "And if I left, I wouldn't be able to face you again, having chickened out." "I would have understood," I began, but he shook his head, stopping me. "I know that. In the short time I've spent with you, I already know you are the kind of person who would understand, who wouldn't hold this over my head. You are aptly named, Grace." He took a small step closer. My heart fluttered joyously. But my pride, my manhood, suffers enough with this scrambled brain of mine already, and I wouldn't have been able to bring myself to admit my cowardice to you."
I didn't know what to say. I could insist he wasn't a coward, but if my instincts were right about him, it wouldn't change his mind.
"Besides, if I left, I wouldn't be able to face you anyway."
The corners of his mouth turned down slightly. The wounded puppy look marring his handsome features made me smile.
"You sent me on my way before I could ask for your phone number."
He glanced up at the numbered plaque above my sister's door.
"All I have is this address, Pemberton Manor, apartment 3A, and if I wasn't coming back here, that meant I wouldn't be seeing you again. Nor would I be getting stuck in an elevator with you again. And I simply couldn't let that happen."
"Oh," I said, the word coming out breathy and about an octave higher than usual. His thumb was moving in small circles over the back of my hand again, and my toes were indeed beginning to curl. "Mr. August!" Itzy's voice rang out from behind him in the hallway as she burst out of apartment 3C and came barreling toward us. August turned around just as Itzy launched herself at him, throwing her thin little arms around his waist. He stumbled and thrust his hands out to try to right himself, but it was all in vain. He was going down and taking Itzy with him. I lurched forward, shoved my shoulder into the middle of his back, and wrapped my arms around his chest as I planted my big feet firmly on the ground behind him. "I've got you," I said, close to his ear, holding us all upright and stable. "Oh, Itzy," Lucy scolded, bustling down the hall with surprising agility despite her advanced stage of pregnancy. "You can't just throw yourself at people. You almost knocked August over." "But Gracie's got him," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "And I got him too, don't I, Mr. August?" From over his shoulder, I could see her little face peering up at him.
"Yes, you do," he replied, nodding slowly. "You both do."
"We won't let you fall, will we, Grace?" she said, catching my eye.
"Nope, no falling allowed," I concurred. "I think it might be a little too late for that," August murmured, so low I almost missed it. But I knew the words were meant for my ears alone, and I ducked my head, not wanting Lucy to see me blush. Itzy stepped back and put her hands on her little hips. Lucy came up behind her, apology radiating from her eyes.
"You didn't say goodbye," Itzy stated, her lower lip popping out as a show of her hurt feelings. "You just left." I started to loosen my hold around August, but he cupped his large hands over mine where they crossed over his chest, and then slid my arms down so I now encircled his waist. I could hardly think with the nearness of him, and I desperately hoped he couldn't feel the erratic pounding of my heart through the layers of clothes he wore. And there was that delicious clean smell again. I breathed in slowly, filling my lungs with it, closing my eyes so I could see August more clearly in my mind.
"I know, Itzy, and I'm sorry," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest, the vibrations rolling right through me. "And that crazy elevator knew it too. When I got back on it to go home, I moved the crank for it to take me down to the ground floor, but the silly thing came up here instead."
"'Course it did, 'cause you needed some good huggins, right?" She stepped forward and hugged him once more, this time stretching her arms out past him to try to include me in the embrace too. I could feel her little fingers scrabbling at my waist, and I smiled against August's shoulder. "Everyone needs huggins on Christmas," Itzy added, before turning back to her mother and wrapping her arms around the woman. "Even brothers need hugs, right, Ollie?" she asked, before kissing her mother's belly. I couldn't tell if August was kidding or not about the elevator bringing him up instead of down,
But I didn't care. Part of me wanted to believe that just the tiniest bit of Christmas magic had swept in on that east wind with me, bringing our oddball little group together on this most miraculous of all nights. I'd heard Sarah say many times about the residents of Pemberton Manor, "We're all a bunch of misfits here, so we all fit in just fine." And even though I didn't actually live here, for tonight, for this moment, I felt like I belonged here, standing in this third-floor hallway with a very pregnant, sad-eyed Lucy and her frighteningly intuitive child, Itzy, with August and his scrambled brain and borderline inappropriate need for touch, with my spotted sister and her brassy love just on the other side of the door behind me. Me, Bigfoot, warrior woman, monolith, a rock. Me, with my arms wrapped securely around a man who just might need me to be all those things for him. This was not a night of goodbyes, but of new beginnings, and I was exactly who I wanted to be, exactly where I wanted to be this Christmas Eve. Wasn't it fun meeting Grace Winters and August Jones in The Goodbye Girl, Pemberton Manor Book 1? And what about that little Itzy girl? Don't you worry, though. Grace is finished with saying goodbye to folks, and that includes you. In fact, now that she's met the very pregnant Lucy Farnsworth, Grace isn't about to walk away from the little family, not when she can clearly see that they're in need of a helping hand. Lucy Farnsworth is running for her life, and for the lives of her babies, too. When the neighbor in the apartment below her reports her for disturbing the peace, Lucy is terrified of the attention she's getting, of what the good folks at Pemberton Manor might learn about her past. But on the night of the first full moon of the new year, every wall she's worked so hard to build comes crashing down around her, and Lucy finds sanctuary in the most unlikely of places and help from the most unlikely of people. Keep listening to Lucy and Itzy's story in The Moon Mother, Pemberton Manor, Book 2. We hope you've enjoyed this production of The Goodbye Girl, Pemberton Manor, Book 1, written and narrated by Becky Doughty. Copyright 2016 by Becky Doughty. Production copyright 2022 by Becky Doughty. This has been a Brave Hearts Press audio production. Thank you for listening.